GRC applications, the base year for our rate case will be 2021. It'll be the same forecast years that we are talking about for the ramp. And then our post-test years will be 2025, 26, and 2027. Okay, next slide, Joe. All right, so as it relates to the overall settlement process, I on the green chart in the previous slide talked about it all starts with the SMAP settlement. Anything in the gray boxes here are things that we've done to date, other than the box where you said we are here. The step 2B is where we are having this workshop to talk about the enterprise risks that are going to be included in RAMP. We haven't done step 3 yet, perform this mitigation analysis. There's a lot of work that goes into that, and we'll be doing that, after this workshop, all the way up to when we file the RAMP in in May of next year. Yeah, I think that's all I had to cover on here. So why don't I stop there, see if there's any questions. That's the end of my first introduction slides.
Hi, Chuck. Yeah, this is Tom. Could you go back to the timeline slide?
Sure. Hey, Tom.
Hi. Let me just make sure I'm understanding. I guess what I want to understand is the concept of the base year for the 2021 ramp. Mm-hmm. You said that that's the last year of recorded data that you'll have. But for purposes of assessing the effectiveness, the risk reduction of mitigations, what period of analysis is going to be used as the baseline against which you're comparing the risk reduction? Do you understand my question?
Not specifically. Try it again.
Okay. All right. So this is an issue we've raised in the past, and it's called to mind by this slide, that the risk reduction by a mitigation. We're trying to use this to inform your next GRC, which, as the slide shows, has a test year of 2024. We should not be including risk reduction in your assessment of the effectiveness of, or the risk reduction of mitigations. I'm hoping you're not planning to include risk reduction that you expect to achieve in years prior to 2024, because we're interested in the risk reduction you will achieve in the test year and beyond to assess the effectiveness of the mitigation or the risk reduction of the mitigation. Are we in sync on that, or do we have a difference of opinion?
I think we are. I'll let Mason clarify but 2020 is that year, that comparison year.
Well, that's what I'm concerned about, and I'm happy to hear from Mason. Maybe Mason should speak, but that's different from what I just said. That we think should happen.
Okay. Yeah, Mason, you're having clarification.
Yeah, I think, Tom, that's something we need to work out. We were planning on doing the analysis for the 22 to 24 period, but exactly addressing your concern, I think we need to hear more of how you're thinking about it before we can answer specifically.
Well, again, can we agree the issue for the 2024 GRC is we are trying to forecast the risk reduction that will be achieved by using mitigations that would apply beginning 2024 and beyond. What's happened before that is already happened, so that's not the issue in the GRC. So that you should be modeling risk reduction that you expect to occur 2024 and beyond. So for that reason, you should be treating as already achieved the risk reduction that has occurred based on recorded data, and also that you expect to achieve based on, what you expect for years 2022 and 2023. Understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think we understand your point of view. I'm not sure if we're prepared to commit to exactly how we're doing the analysis, because most of the quant is based on nearer term risk scoring available to us. If it's decided that we want to do risk scores based on 2025 and beyond, for example, we would have to consider that. So.
Well, first of all, I'm saying 2024 and beyond, because that's what the issue is for the rate case. And the point is that a certain amount of risk reduction will be achieved based on the prior rate case. And you don't want to double count that risk reduction in determining the risk reduction that will be achieved or that you're forecasting to achieve in this modeling for the year 2024 and beyond. We only want to include the risk reduction for 2024 and beyond. Right?
And well, let me remind folks how we present our rate cases. So we will ask the commission for a revenue requirement in the test year 2024, and typically we will have a mechanism. We don't forecast specific projects in our post-test years. The only time we've done that was in our last rate case, where we had the separate PSEP projects that we were ordered to include in our rate case, and we kind of forecast those in every given year. But typically our rate case requests, we go up including the test year, and then we request a mechanism to take over from there for a revenue requirement.
Yeah, that's not germane to what I'm talking about. I know, I understand all that. We all know that.
Okay.
What I'm talking about is what's the baseline that you're using for risk reduction is based on the mitigation, on the risk score after the mitigation. I'm sorry, the risk score before the mitigation minus the risk score after the mitigation. The question is, what is the baseline year for the risk score before the mitigation? It should be the end of 2023, not 2020 or 2021. Otherwise, you're double counting risk reduction that's been achieved in the prior rate case.
This is Marty Kurtovich. I wanted to give an example of what Tom's talking about. In the SCE GRC, they provided a risk profile for wildfire, and it showed the distribution per circuit mile of wildfire risk on their 10,000 miles of distribution line in the high fire threat area. What Tom is talking about, SCE did in their GRC, where they did a benchmark year for wildfire risk, and then the Safety and Policy Division asked Edison to show what the effects of the mitigation would be on that risk profile. Edison said they could not do it, but the point is they provided 2018 as a benchmark year for the risk profile, and that is what we should use for basing whether their mitigations are successful or not.
And Marty, this is Jamie York with the Sempra Utilities. Was that for their 2020 general rate case?
I think it's 2021.
So Tom, I hear what you're saying. I mean, generally what you're asking for would require us to provide RAMP forecasts for, as Chuck mentioned, our post-test years, so 2025 through 27. And we don't, that's not something that we generally do in rate cases or in RAMP.
No.
Yes, but I would disagree, because you guys have just instituted this WINGS methodology, which is a scenario analysis. So it sounds like you guys are already on track for that.
Hey, Marty, I think we're getting a little into the weeds here. I appreciate your comments, but without the proper context, which might take time to develop, I think it's going to be hard for people to digest what you're getting at. Maybe we should table that for a separate discussion, either offline or at another time. I would also like to remind people that this workshop is being recorded so that you can refer back to it at some future date.
But let me just try to succinctly state my issue. 2023 should be the base year. It has nothing to do with the post-test years. So I don't know, Jamie, why you raised that. 2023 should be the base year. I don't know what base year you're talking about for your analysis, but 2023 should be the base year because we want to have the mitigation that's achieved through the risk reduction is achieved through the mitigations you're thinking of applying in the 2024 GRC measured against the risk reduction that will already have been accomplished through 2023. Otherwise, we're double counting risk reduction, which we don't want. PG&E is doing it, says they're going to do it this way in their GRC. And so I'm surprised that we're even having trouble understanding the issue. This issue's been kicked around for a while.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I get it, Tom. We'll definitely have to take that one offline. Yeah, I think we were confused that you were thinking we needed to go out into the post-test years, but you're talking about a comparison to 2023. So I think it took us a while to figure what you were specifically asking here. But okay, yeah, we're gonna have to take that one we're gonna have to whiteboard that one and parking lot that and see if we can address that offline.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay, any other questions? All right, great, thanks. I'm gonna kick this off now for Mason Withers for the next segment. So thanks, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mason Withers. I'm the Quantitative Risk and Controls Manager at SDG&E. I will be presenting these sections on behalf of SoCalGas and SDG&E. I just wanted to get out of the way, some COVID logistics. I'm at home. I'm at my desk. I've got my family in the background. You might hear some noises. I'm not controlling the slide deck. Joe McCauley is, so there could be some things going on. You might hear page turning. You might see my head turning to look at other monitors that I've got. So that's just the life that we live in right now. So please be patient. With that said, let's go to the next slide, Joe. So, the intent of the pre-ramp workshop is to show you the final list, the determination of the final risk list that we have for the 2021 filing. We have a preliminary list we'd like to show you today, and that's going to come in a few slides from now. That's the main purpose. And then we want to show that we're fulfilling the settlement agreement requirements, the 3 steps. We've given the list 14 days in advance, and we're going to walk through the safety risk scores, and then we're going to talk about our multi-attribute value function and how we went through doing that. So we will be taking feedback during the call, during the question period, and after this meeting as well. Next slide, Joe. So the general overview is we started with our enterprise risk registers that each of the companies have. SoCalGas has 14 risks in their register, and SDG&E has 22 in its. And then per the settlement agreement, we did a safety assessment through the risk assessment to evaluate all the risks that had scores in the safety part for greater than 0. And SoCalGas had 9 of those, and SDG&E had 14. Then also by the settlement agreement, we are showing the top 40% of those. We show also the other attributes in the MAVF, which in this case are reliability, financial, and trust. So the top 40% for SoCalGas is the top 4. 40% of 9 is 3.6. We rounded up to 4. And then the top 40% of SDG&E is 6 of those risks. So today you'll be seeing the full attribute scores for SoCalGas for 4 of the risks and SDG&E for 6. However, we preliminarily believe that we want to have 7 risks in the ramp for SoCalGas and 9 for SDG&E. So we're not limiting what we put in the ramp just to that 40% cutoff or analysis. So that concludes the beginning cutoff of the slides. Any questions on those 2? Okay, hearing none. The next section is risk quantification overview. Before we go, I'd like to thank Christine Wong and Alana Norman for helping me put these slides together. Without them, none of this would be possible. So our risk quantification framework, that's what we call it at SoCalGas and SDG&E. It's basically our version of the multi-attribute value function. And you can see the 6 principles listed here. We followed all 6 principles. And you can see the visual demonstration of the risk quantification framework. There's 4 top-level attributes: health and safety, reliability, financial, and trust and reputation. Underneath health and safety are fatality, serious injury, and acres burned, which we will get into in bigger detail further. Reliability is a combination of gas reliability and electric reliability. Financial is just financial, and trust is a new attribute that we're including, and it focuses on the stakeholder impact with the company. So proceeding on, this is a more tabular form of those attributes, showing the settlement agreement view of things with the ranges and the weights. We did file a RAMP in 2019, and the big change from there on this slide is that we've added trust and reputation with a 5% weighting, and that 5% came out of the financial, which was 20%. We've also adjusted some ranges accordingly. Okay, next slide there. And then this is the more detailed view. It's basically the same thing. That top blue box is pretty much what we just saw on the previous slide, and then it's broken out further below. So I'll focus on the health and safety index over there in the kind of middle on the left. Similar to last time, we're including, from a human health standpoint, fatalities and serious injuries. And based upon outside external work through academia and the government, we are weighting serious injuries to be 0.25 of a safety unit and fatalities at 1. So that hasn't changed. What has changed is the inclusion of acres burned. And it's shown here in health and safety, specifically focusing on the aspect of when a wildfire burns, it creates pollution in the air that has significant health implications. And there's been plenty of research in the government and academia to discuss what those implications are. And we thought it was a prudent thing to do to include it into the health and safety aspect. Just a few months ago, I think we all felt the ramifications of the wildfires and the pollution coming into our cities and the populated areas. The valuation shown here is taken pretty much straight from some studies that were done, again, in academia and the government. We'd be happy to share those when the time is right. Essentially, it puts a human value of safety and health per acre burned. We know it's more complicated than that. This is our first pass at including wildfire in this manner. Oops, sorry, Joe. And then, you know, an acre is not an acre. We get that, but this is a generalized view of that. So that's the main change to the health and safety index. The reliability index is pretty similar. I'm going down on the left side. Reliability is pretty similar to what we've done in the past. I'd like to make clear how we're presenting it here because we are showing SoCalGas and SDG information on the same slide. For reliability, there are a few differences between the two companies. So whenever you see a slash shown, the SDG&E is on the left side of the slash and SoCalGas is shown on the right side of the slash. So, for example, on gas curtailment, the threshold of the million cubic feet is reached at 80 for SDG&E and it's reached at 250 for SoCalGas. I hope you can see that in the lower left. I don't have access to pointing to the screen like I would in person with the pointer. And then in the ranges, you can see it says 0 to 250 for SDG&E and 0 to 500 for SoCalGas. And for gas curtailment in particular, that's the amount above the threshold that we've talked about in the past. And that's also true for the ranges for gas meters loss of service. The SDG&E range goes to 50,000, SoCalGas range goes to 100,000. Then on the weights, it's also important to know because SDG&E serves both gas and electric, the weighting for the reliability sub-attributes is equal at 25% each. But SoCalGas doesn't have the electric service, and so the weighting is 50% for each of their sub-attributes, gas curtailment and gas meters loss of service. That's the reliability index. And then kind of circling around to the trust and reputation, this is a new attribute, as I mentioned. And the way we're looking at it is in terms of stakeholder groups. So if you see the asterisk underneath that table, the stakeholder groups that we are interested in are customers, employees, the public, government, and regulators. And so the way that we're proposing to measure the trust and reputation is from the relationship with those stakeholders. And there's kind of three ways we're talking about measuring it, or the sort of three variables. One is how many stakeholder groups got affected by the risk event. You can see we say 5. That's basically all 5 stakeholder groups got affected as the worst case scenario. So there's a stakeholders affected sort of variable, which is all of them, 3 to 4 of them, 2 to 3, and then 1. So the fewer stakeholders, the lower the score would be. Then there's also a severity. It's like, okay, they got affected, but how bad was it? And that also goes along with the duration. How long did the effect last? So an example, and these scale from 0 to 100. An example, the worst case scenario would be some very bad risk event which affected all the stakeholders in a very bad way, and it was long lasting. That would be a score of a 100. Something like an event which only affected one stakeholder. So for example, employees. If there was an event that affected employees in a minor way and it didn't last very long, it would be no more than 5, and it would probably be less than 5. So that's a numerical way that we're proposing we discuss trust and reputation. There's a lot of ways to look at it. We try to discover all the different ways to think of it. And I think this is the most straightforward way. Admittedly, it is certainly less quantitative in nature than the others, because it does take a little bit of trying to understand the relationships. Whenever relationships are involved, there's less quantification. So this is our attempt at quantifying how much the impact in the trust and reputation there is with our stakeholders. Before we take questions, I'd like to walk through some examples of how we use this risk quantification framework. So Joe, if you could go to the next slide, please. In this illustrative example, we're talking about SDG&E employee safety. And the way the settlement agreement calls for it is that you look at if an event were to happen, how bad would it be? And it also calls for looking at the average of that. We all know that every single event isn't the same. There's a wide range of how employees could get hurt, but this is the average or the expected value of that. So this is in the settlement agreement parlance, this is called the core. So our analysis in this illustrative example said that if the event were to happen, on average, 0.4 safety units would be generated. And if you remember from the previous slide, a fatality would be a safety unit of 1, and a serious injury would be a safety unit of 0.25. So 0.4 you can see is kind of the average would be more than just a serious injury. It could be a mix of multiple serious injuries or the rare fatality. The analysis also shows that there is no direct reliability impact from the employee events. There was roughly a $1.1 million consequence if the event were to occur, and we believe that it would affect the trust and reputation score by a factor of 2 on average. So that's analysis that we do per risk, if it were to happen, how bad would it be? And just to be clear, these are not precise numbers because in many of these cases, these are just estimates based on data and there's uncertainty around these numbers. So when we say expected value, that's the average. There's obviously ranges and uncertainty around that. But this is what we get when we do the average consequent per event or the core. Then separately, we ask ourselves, well, how likely is the event to occur? Remember the top part there is if it were to occur, how bad would it be? And then the lower here is the likelihood of the event. And we're saying it's 0.9 in a given year that there will be an event. So let's walk through how the core uses the risk quantification framework to calculate a quantified core number. So using the inputs from above, the 0.4, if you remember back to the previous slide, the range for health and safety goes to 20. So you divide the 0.4 by the 20. And that shows you like how far into that range you're going. Then the weighting for health and safety is 60%. So you multiply the 0.4 divided by 20 by 60%. And that gives you the health component of the core score. Because there's no reliability, we just put in a 0, but in reality, it's 0 divided by 1 times 20%. But for this, we're just showing that it's a 0. Then for financial, the range goes to 500 million, and this is 1.1 million. So the math is 1.1 divided by 500 times the weighting for financial, which is 15%. Excuse me. I'll be taking water breaks throughout. It's pretty dry here. And then the trust and reputation range goes to 100. So we add in 2 over 100 multiplied by the weight, which is 5%. Now, if you just stopped there, you would always get decimals. You'd get 0.0 something, because the way the core is derived, the worst case scenario for all attributes would get you a 1. That's just how the math is. And we didn't want to bear the burden of confusing everybody with these small decimals. So we're multiplying it all by 100,000 to make it more readable. And when you do that, you get the core of 1,298. Then in the end, the risk score is simply the lower times the core. And that would be 0.9 from above and 1298 from above, giving you 1168. Actually, because I'm going to kind of break the protocol, I'm going to pause right there because the next slide is not directly related to this. And I want to see if there's any questions on anything I've said up to this point.
Chuck, go ahead, please.
Mason, I take it that since you are not using any other multiplications other than the scaled value and the fraction of the scaled value with respect to the range of the scaled value in the range of the natural unit values, I take it that all of your scaling functions are linear.
That's correct.
And so when you say that you've written down the average, you mean you've taken the expected value of the probability distribution on the natural unit of the attribute. Is that correct?
No, I would say the inputs, the 0.4 is the average of the distribution of the safety events in the conditional event that it occurred.
We're saying the same thing. I agree. I understand.
Okay.
Next question, please. I see that there's no reliability example here. I think in your next one, there'll be a reliability example. Is that right?
We do later in this presentation, we do have an example that includes reliability. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll hold the question until then. Thank you.
And good to hear from you, Chuck.
Hi, Mason. This is David. Can you hear me?
Hey, David.
Hey, I have a question about the lore. I think we submitted some comments the last go around discussing whether the frequency versus the likelihood and so on. And so I'm wondering if Sempra has updated its methodology to now make it a real likelihood in terms of frequency. And part of the reason I'm asking is I'm looking at SoCalGas example, and they still have a lore of 2,900. And so does that mean Sempra has not updated its lore to to reflect the likelihood of between 0 and 1?
Yes, we are giving the lore in terms of the frequency.
Okay. I was under the impression that the commission clearly ordered Sempra to update its methodology to be compliant with the settlement, and this was one of the issues addressed. So are you guys not updating your methodology?
Yeah, we believe we are compliant with the settlement. The settlement includes the terminology of frequency. So, yeah.
Thank you for raising your hand, Joseph Mitchell. You're next.
Okay. Hi, Mason. This is Joseph Mitchell, Mussey Grade Road Alliance.
Hey, Joe.
Hey. When you did your original RAMP filing last year, one of the things that really stood out was the discrepancy between SDG&E's internal risk management calculations and the MAVF. For wildfire, the values were, it was quite anomalous as far as your internal risk score being much higher than the equivalent MAVF score. Have you adapted it any way for that? Just interjecting this to begin with. I see that the adding the acres will partly do that because it does add an additional safety risk, and it's about 20,000 acres per life equivalent if I've done the calculation correctly. So a witch fire, for instance, would be 15 fatality equivalents, even though the witch fire wasn't responsible for a lot of that. And as participants in the PG&E ramp, we're getting the sort of sneak preview on how some of this stuff plays out. And one of the things that we see is that, and this is a concern I raised in the earlier SDG&E ramp, is that capping the maximum scores below what is a foreseeable loss will suppress your averages. So, and I'm somewhat concerned that you're maxing out your ranges at such low values, because the financial maximum can extend way above 500 million. Fatalities, as we saw with the campfire, can extend way above 20. So one thing we're experimenting with in the PG&E ramp is uncapped risk values. And would it be possible for you to explore uncapped values in your MAVF estimations?
Okay, Joe, nice seeing you again. I'm going to try to see if I can get all of your, you kind of bundled a few in, yeah. So in our opinion, there is no direct correlation between the ERR methods and the MAVF for the ramp. And those are separate things. We don't necessarily tie direct funding requests to the ERR. The ERR is more of a communication tool for the executives to understand risk scoring. It's not used for decision making directly. It's more illustrative in its context. The MAVF is the tool that we plan on using to make budgetary requests and internal decision making. So we think as long as the MAVF tells the right story, it doesn't have to be a one-to-one correlation with whatever's in the ERR process. So that's one thing. And to your other point, on that same note, we believe that the addition of acres burn and trust tells a better story. We all knew that the safety, reliability, financial didn't capture the whole picture for wildfire risk, and we were trying to figure out how to do that better. We don't think this is the final version of, in 20 years from now, we're not going to be using the same version, but we think this is a step towards determining wildfire risk, more comprehensively, might be a better way to say it. So we added acres burned because we knew that was an element that wasn't necessarily being picked up. It's not just homes being burned and people dying. There's other impacts going on to society in addition to those. So hopefully that's understood. As far as the capping goes, Joe, I think this is more of a math thing, and we're trying to follow the settlement agreement to the letter. But to some regard, the capping doesn't apply to what we're doing, because the capping is more from the expected value standpoint. So if we're looking at the expected value of a consequence, if it does exceed 500 million or whatever the cap is, we can extend past that. But none of our expected values go beyond that, the way that we're thinking about it. So we're not allowing the cap to prevent us from going above if that came up. It's because we're looking at expected values, though.
So just to clarify, when you're running your Monte Carlo, you can get losses greater than 500 million, fatalities greater than 20.
Oh yes, sir. Well, unfortunately, well above. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, and similarly for the safety. Yeah.
Understood. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Hi, this is Melinda Dickinson. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. I'm sorry, I don't have the ability. I don't see the place to raise your hand on my screen. I have concerns about the trust and reputation addition. That sounds a lot like we're focused on the company's bottom line, which is not supposed to be the ramp's function. We're supposed to be talking about risks to the public and consequences to the public and how to alleviate the risks to the public, not to the company's, marketing strategies or things like that. So I would strongly urge trust and reputation to be eliminated, but that just does not sound like we're heading in the right direction. We're going in the wrong direction with that one. How was that developed?
So if I could address the first part, Melinda, and nice to meet you. I don't think we've met in person before. Joe, if you could go back to, yeah. So the stakeholders these are specifically not shareholder stakeholders. These are outside entities that we feel that when events happen, it affects these groups to some extent. It's partly the relationship we have with those groups, but it's also those groups in general. If something happens that affects those stakeholders, it is something very real that causes an issue with them. And then that leads to a trust and reputation hit to our company as well. And it make it harder for us to do the things that we want to do with the community, get the things that we want to be able to do from a reliability standpoint or from a rate making standpoint. So we feel that, yeah.
That brings me to the second part of my concern, which is it sounds a lot like double counting. When you're talking about something real happening, that should be what is quantified, not the amorphous result of the actual result. It sounds like double counting, and it sounds like ultimately we're worried about the company's profits.
Yeah, I don't take it as profit. When we're measuring the score, we're not thinking at all about how it affects our bottom line. In fact, I think our business model wouldn't allow for anything like that. So we're definitely not thinking of the bottom line when we're working on the impact it has on these various stakeholders. And as to the double counting question, there are a lot of things that are not captured, as I was just mentioning with Joe Mitchell. There are a lot of things that are not captured by safety, reliability, and financial alone. And we thought this was one way to be able to incorporate those concepts at a 5% weighting into the mix. Some of the history is we were asked to consider the types of attributes that the company thinks about when we make decisions. And we certainly think about how our relationships are with stakeholders. So we've sort of been asked to include those things.
Well, your relationships, yeah. I mean, I guess if you're talking about reputation, I don't know. It sounds really bad. Reputation, you're talking about your reputation. You're not talking about, the things that you listed about how it would affect you, those are all things that what I'm hearing would fall into one of the other categories. Anyways, I don't expect to resolve it. I just wanted to raise it as a serious concern.
Yeah, we appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
This is Ed Harkovich. So let me paraphrase what I think I heard, Melinda, and that is that let's say an employee gets injured and he's categorized as a stakeholder, but he's also being counted in the serious injury and fatality section as well. So is that characterizing your concern about double counting?
I suppose so. Yeah, that would be one example. I guess.
Can you think of other examples that might illustrate your concern?
I'm sure I can. Yeah, I don't know if I can do it on the spot, but I'm just seeing this now. I know you guys sent this around yesterday, but I did not have time to take a look, so I apologize for that. But I would appreciate having further conversations about it beyond now.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is David. I have a follow-up question. I was kind of surprised to hear, Mason talk about the frequency versus likelihood issue. These are all defined terms in the settlement and in the commission decision. And the commission specifically stated that the frequency is not the same as likelihood. It also said likelihood needs to be between 0 and 1. It also said that this lower should represent a likelihood of the risk event. So how is it that you guys are defining as it's okay to use frequency for likelihood? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, sure. So from a math perspective, when we're looking at things at the risk level, for example, in the example that you mentioned yourself, David, later on we're going to talk about gas dig-ins on the distribution side. Those events are they happen unfortunately very frequently, something over 2,000 times a year, and so the likelihood of a dig-in happening in a given year at the risk level is nearly 100%. Because we know it's going to happen. It's if you did the math, the likelihood of an event which happens 2,000 times a year to happen at least once in a given year is like 0.999 out to like 30 decimal points. So from a practical standpoint, to communicate risk to the commission, we're using the frequency that the definition that's also in the settlement agreement that says when you're looking at things at the risk level, the commission wants to know how many times we're going to have a dig-in. And we're telling them that's a frequency number. And then when you do a mitigation, how fewer dig-ins are you going to have due to that mitigation? And the proportionality between the before and after is a very relevant communication tool. If you went strictly by likelihood, grouped by risks, like the way that the settlement agreement calls for it, the math is extremely complicated. And I'm pretty sure that if we walked through some examples, not in this forum with 94 participants, you'd see that going from 0.99 with 30 decimals to 0.99 with 29 decimals is not a very informative way to communicate risk reduction to the commission. I believe likelihood is an extremely important tool to use when you're looking at it from a slightly different point of view. But when you're looking at it from a grouped risk perspective, where events are almost 100% chance that it's going to happen, frequency is a better tool to communicate to the commission why we want to proceed with mitigations. And we believe it's in the settlement agreement that allows us to do that.
Wait, hold on. So it's in the frequency is in the settlement agreement. In fact, it says frequency is not the same as likelihood. That's what the settlement specifically calls out. And so we're not asking you what's a better communication tool. So it seems like even you acknowledge that your methodology is not complying with what's spelled out in the settlement.
David, I did not acknowledge that. I was very clear that I did not acknowledge that. Please do not put words in my mouth.
You did acknowledge. You said it's not using likelihood, which is what the settlement requires.
Okay, I agree we are not using likelihood, yes. I also said we believe we are compliant with the settlement agreement. Do you, what benefit do you think using likelihood will give?
I'm not asking you what benefit. I'm asking you if you're complying with the agreement, which spells out you need to use likelihood for. It's called the likelihood of risk event. It's not called the frequency of risk event. So I don't understand. After all these rounds of comments, Sempra still decided to just do whatever it wants without complying with the settlement, and that's really troubling to me.
Okay, thank you for your feedback.
This is Joseph Mitchell. David, I asked you to look at our filing on the original SDG&E ramp submission last fall. We have a discussion of frequency versus likelihood in that, and show the relationship mathematically. And the problem is that you don't get a correct result if you use likelihood only with extremely frequent events in that interval. You can go to a shorter interval, perhaps, and then you could use likelihood, but it will not give you a correct result to use the likelihood. So I know that's what's in the settlement agreement, but I think the utilities are working around that. I think we've seen that in other proceedings as well. So that's something we can probably discuss in the SNAP proceeding.
So this is Tom. Thanks, Joe. We'll think about this issue some more. I wanted to go back to the issue of the trust reputation attribute, and wanted to say my questions are not intended to be a criticism of it, but just to try to understand it better. So Mason, you don't need to change slides, but I see on the next slide when you were going through the example, you had a number of 2 for the expected value, or what you're calling the average. Yeah, and now if we can go back to the previous slide. And so first question is, how does that translate into what you're showing on this slide? And then the second question, related question, is what does it mean for a stakeholder group to be affected? Like, I sort of understand it for customers, employees. I'm not sure what's different about the public. And maybe government means local government. I'm not sure about that. And regulators, I really don't understand how what does that mean for them to be affected? So maybe you could help me understand this a little better. Again, not in a view to criticize it, but just to understand it.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for the question. First of all, the 2 was derived by looking at this table. And, there's more to the math than just what's shown in front of us here. And to be honest, we're still fine-tuning. We have quite a few months before the RAMP filing, and this is where we are right now. And based upon feedback, we're very happy to listen to that feedback. The 2 comes from the example with the employee, which we think when an employee injury occurs, there is an opportunity for other employees to feel affected by that event. So imagine an employee gets a serious injury, and just to remind everyone on the phone, a serious injury these are big deals. These are permanent life damage or a night in the hospital. These are significant events. So it's possible that other employees feel affected by the event, whether that be they are less certain about the safety of what's going on with the company or their own profession or whatever. So we don't think that employee events necessarily get out into, like, it doesn't necessarily affect the public as much from that perspective. So it's limited to one stakeholder. So we think the value would probably not exceed 5, even in worse situations. And then on average, because not every event is severe in nature, that it would be moved down to a 2 for its expected value. As an example, something like a massive wildfire that affected the entire community would hit all 5 of these stakeholder groups, we believe. And depending on the severity of the wildfire, it could be closer to 100 if the severity was lower, or if it had a shorter duration of its impact, it would be somewhat less than 100. But that's the way we're thinking of, is sort of the number is kind of like the top end of that, and it goes down depending on the severity and the duration of the event. Does that make sense to some degree to help explain where the 2 came from?
Well, does 2 mean, when we were thinking about it, we thought maybe you had this sort of notion of stakeholder months or something, or stakeholder weeks or something like that, that there's sort of this, like a 2 could mean that 2 stakeholder groups are affected for a very short time, or one stakeholder group is affected for a longer time.
It could, yeah. So
sort
for
of,
example, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry for the crosstalk. If there was an event that affected a few stakeholders, like maybe these middle ones, but it was not really that big of a deal, it could also be a 2. Whereas a one stakeholder event, which started as a 5, if it was a pretty big deal but not full, it could also be a 2. So you can get to 2 different ways. Just like you can get to, on a safety unit score, you could get to 2 from it being 8 serious injuries, or you can get there from being 2 fatalities. It's a similar nature, that it's like how you get there is important. And so the expected value of the types of events that we think the employees see as of right now would be a 2.
Okay, and again, just to try to understand the notion of what it means for something to affect a stakeholder group, and I'm going to focus on the regulators one, because that's the one maybe I understand least at this point. But I'm sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, but it's just meant to be a question. Do you mean something that would make regulators unhappy? Is that to be affected? And maybe that's the way it is for all these groups. Is it something that would cause them to have a diminished view of the utility were this thing to happen?
In this case, Tom, I think you're reading my mind very, very closely. That's a large part of it. Yes, did an event occur which essentially made the regulatory bodies need to react in a way that was either negative towards the company or maybe diminish the trust level there, but also basically how the regulators needed to do something about it as well. Like, there's steps that are taken after events, that the big events, they can open up OIIs and other types of things or investigations. Those are the types of things that we don't want to have happen, right? We want to limit those types of events so that the regulatory bodies can kind of just do business as usual to some extent. We don't want them to have to say, now what happened, and then have to start some new course of action due to it. So it's not just the trust, there's some kind of impact from that perspective as well. I know that's probably not clear, and you probably want to see that more in writing, and we definitely want to put that more in writing, exactly how we are thinking about it, and then how we would measure it. To be fair, this is the first time that we've put this out in the public like this. We're fairly committed to it, but we're willing to listen to feedback to make sure we're thinking about it the right way.
Right. And just one more, this is more of a comment. And again, I'm not intending to endorse or not endorse, just still thinking, but something that does occur to me and that has occurred to Turn in the past is where something like this might be helpful is when we're thinking about PSPS as a mitigation, because that's been an issue, is that, and particularly, not to mention another utility that's not here, but I will mention another utility that's not here. I mean, PG&E had a lot of issues with with trust and reputation when the way it first carried out its PSPSs, and if PSPS is not done properly, that does seem like something that should be thought about in thinking about using that mitigation or using that, or employing that. And so I could see this maybe as being valuable, although I also think that another way to get at that could be just to recognize there's financial and other safety and other harms to a lot of these groups that you've identified. This trust attribute as also as financially or otherwise affected in their safety from PSPS. But anyway, I'm just thinking about it in PSPS context. It might have some usefulness, but there might be other ways of getting at that as well. And yeah, I appreciate Melinda's comments. I'm not trying to disagree with Melinda, but I just am thinking aloud about ways that there might be some value to this, although we're still going to think about it.
So I have a feeling Joe wants to chime in, but before that, Joe, Tom, I want to address the PSPS comment. We are very much interested in including trust and reputation as a negative impact from PSPS. We think of PSPS as a sub-risk of wildfire, and it definitely has implications and consequences: safety, financial reliability, trust. And we plan very much to include I would say, the negative side of PSPS in our decision making. We have a model called WINGS that very much takes the wildfire risk and the PSPS impacts and looks at them both and tries to find solutions on how to reduce the risk from both of those, reduce the impacts from both of those. Not to look at them in isolation, not to think that PSPS is free, because it's not free. There's a lot of implications from PSPS. We have walked through WINGS with some of the commission staff. It's not fully understood, I would say, by anybody outside of our company yet, but it definitely is. The plan is to include PSPS impacts, and one of those impacts we believe is the trust side, where there's definitely safety, financial reliability, but there is something else that we think is captured by trust through the PSPS to the customers and to the public and the government, frankly. So I hope that helps. I think we're saying the same thing, and obviously, again, this is October, the filing's in May, more words to be written, more thoughts to be thought before then. So I hope that helps for now. Okay, I got the thumbs up. Joe, thank you.
Okay, quick question. One of the big issues that came up during after the 2017 and 2018 fires was the rating agencies and what the bond ratings for the utilities were. Is that a reputation risk? Or is it your financial risk, or do you not consider that?
Yeah, Joe, great question. We do not consider that in any fashion in the ramp. Neither the stock price or the credit rating or anything bottom line to the financial of our corporation is not considered in the ramp numbers
Okay.
at all. And that's still true even with the trust and reputation in place. Thank you for the question.
Welcome.
If I could ask a follow-up question or make a follow-up comment. This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. I'm concerned when you talk about the impact on the regulators, that it could potentially be something negative toward the company. That highlights the concern that I have, because when you're looking at something quote unquote negative, that the regulators need to do something, for the public, it's a positive thing when the regulators are actively regulating the utilities. And from the public perspective and the historical perspective, that's what they're supposed to be doing already. So I think that your response to some of Tom's questions really highlighted the concern that this isn't focused on the risks to employees and the public. This is focused on, it's from the utilities perspective.
Okay, so Melinda, sorry if I wasn't clear with my thoughts about the regulatory group. Obviously, the regulators play a critical role in the state and the way that utilities are run. And we don't have, that's not what this is about. This is about risk events, which would require more action by them that goes above and beyond the expectation or the desire from the regulators. There's been things that have happened in the past, big events where new rules had to be created and lots of workshops had to be held and lots of churn was generated from those risk events. That's what we're trying to prevent. We're not saying don't have regulators. We're saying we don't want to have bad things happen, which forces the regulators to have to go into that other gear and then have to make new rules and have to understand things. We want to prevent things from having to have new rules to begin with, because we don't want those big risks to occur.
Even when they, so even again, if they do occur and the regulators do take action, that would most likely, or is intended and is supposed to lead to more safety, more reliability, better rates for the ratepayers. So it still seems like there's double counting going on, or there's some sort of inaccuracy happening.
Yeah, so not to belabor the point, but when we're thinking about, like I see Ed's face right here, I don't want to burden Ed with a brand new OII. So for example, what I'm saying is we don't want things to happen that require that. So we're saying, how can we measure, like, Ed and his team to not have to do these things? It's not measured by safety, financial, and reliability, right? It's certainly not measured by safety, financial, and reliability. It's measured by the relationships that are going on between us and the commission. And so when bad things happen that forces them to have to do something, that shows you that was a pretty bad risk. And it's not measured in safety, financial, reliability. And I don't think it is. And we're just trying to reflect that, hey, look, something happened that, shouldn't have happened, and we want to prevent those. I'm getting some feedback.
So what you're saying, Mason, is that this is a consequence of when something bad happens. And if the risk doesn't occur, then these costs of involvement with the regulators or with the public or employees don't occur, which then don't have to be accounted for as part of your evaluation of the consequences of those risks.
I think that's right. Yeah.
But we're always happy to do an investigation, Mason. Don't get that confused.
Okay.
Fred, I think Charles had a question, and then after Charles, Fred wants to ask something.
Mason, with respect to the documentation of this attribute, you were asking for feedback, and I think it's very important to define how this attribute is not a proxy for safety or reliability or any financial outcomes, and separate the phenomenon or phenomena that you're trying to capture in this attribute. So documentation along those lines is essential. Second idea for documentation that I think is very important is that you have to describe how you're going to specify the changes in the probability distribution on the level of this attribute when you perform a mitigation. And I think that would be very interesting to see, because the effect of the mitigation on the attribute level is what you're really trying to get at, in my opinion, which is consistent with what Ed just said. Because if nothing happens and you're not mitigating anything, then the levels don't change. And if the levels don't change, there's no risk reduction.
I appreciate the feedback, Chuck. Dr. Feinstein.
Thank you.
Again, I think we remember in the section here, we took a break to seek questions. We're not done with questions. If you have them, you can ask them later. I think this is a good time to keep going through this section, if that's okay.
I wanted to jump in just briefly. This is Fred with the risk section. I think it's completely worthwhile to consider what impact there might be on regulators such as Ed and myself, given that we're already maxed out with doing what we can to help support safety for the community. If we're additionally tasked with yet another incident to have to work on, either we get more staffing support in terms of more hiring supported by Sacramento authorizing more jobs, or something has to slip if we have to have our priority diverted to something new, a new investigation, or working on new requirements, workshops to resolve something that's occurred. It's going to dilute our attention away from the rest of what we're already tasked to do. And I suppose you could argue then that maybe that should show up as a safety impact, but I think it's more difficult to measure that even more indirectly than you're attempting to do here. So that's just my impression of what you're offering.
Thank you, Fred. And yeah, Ed did say you wanted to comment, so I apologize for trying to move on without taking your comment. There's a lot of things going on my screens here. So thank you for that. Joe, let's move on, and then when we get to the end of the section, we'll circle back for any questions that have to do with this entire section, not just the latter half of it. So, RSEs, maybe I want to jump to the bold part at the beginning just to put the context. The way that we're proceeding with our RAMP filing this time around is, the filing's in May, and we are right into the era where we're starting to do the calculations of the RSE, the mitigation effectiveness. That will continue between now and likely November, December timeframe. I don't want to make you guys feel too bad for me, but we have hundreds of mitigations to quantify. It's a lot of mitigations. And so that's what we will be doing. I'll be in my cave between now and December, getting those things done, working with lots of business units to get those numbers. So having said that, the RSE is what it tries to show the effectiveness of moving the risk score per dollar spent. That's the idea of an RSE. And I wanted just to point out that an RSE can be positive or negative depending on the situation. For example, if we are asking to do a new mitigation that hasn't been undertaken before, if we do that, we believe the risk score will go down and therefore the RSE will look positive. On the contrary, there's things that we're doing right now, and we probably want to keep doing them, but we need to show if we stopped doing them, the risk score would actually go back up because they're already in place. So in that regard, an RSE could look negative. We're going to show it as a positive, but I just want people to understand there's kind of a bidirectionality of how risk scores could look. We are going to be doing RSEs on work that's in place and on work that is going forward. New in that regard. So I wanted to mention at this time that when we go through these conversations with the business units to go through their what we call their mitigation list, it's basically a risk reducing activity list for all of the risks in our RAMP. This exercise includes asking them lots of questions about what does this activity do? How do we know how effective it is? How long is that effect going to last? There's lots of questions we ask. And we are going to look at every single one of those mitigations in the context of is it appropriate to do an RSE, and how do we do the RSE on that activity? So that's our RSE methodology slide. More to come. I believe we have another workshop between now and the filing, and I think at that workshop we will have a lot more RSEs and mitigations to talk about. But that's the plan as of right now. Joe, if we could go to the next slide, and I want to walk through a RSE example. I'm focusing on employee as before, so the numbers are consistent within our example, but taking the risk score from like 2 slides ago, and then saying, okay, there's an activity, let's call it a mitigation for a safe driving program. And we think that if that driving program was in place, and this is illustrative, so don't like hang on to the effectiveness numbers, but let's say that we thought the safe driving program would reduce the lower by 1.2%. You could think of it as we believe there's certain aspects to driving, there's certain aspects to employee safety that are due to driving. And then there's certain aspects of driving that can be improved through the safe driving program. And so using some sort of analysis, because this is illustrative, we're not going to go into, but imagine we said, well, we think if we did this driving, employee safety events would be reduced by 1.2% per year. And then let's also say the driving program cost $1 million, and we believed its benefits would last for 3 years. Again, all illustrative. Some people might contend that training needs to be done every year, but in this case, we'll just say it's 3 years. So the pre-mitigation work that we did is shown on the previous slide. The lower was 0.9, the core was 1298, and the risk score was 1168. Now we're saying, what if we did this mitigation? Well, the new lower would be reduced by 1.2%. So the lower will go from 0.9 to 0.89. There's a lot of rounding going on, so we didn't want to show all the decimal places. In this case, though, we're suggesting that the consequence of the event would be similar. We're not changing the consequence. In fact, most of our mitigations reduce the likelihood of the event rather than necessarily being able to reduce the consequence of the event. Some do, but most focus on the likelihood. That's just an aside, but this is an example of one of those. So the new lower would be dropped to 0.89, the core stays the same. So the new mitigated risk score is now 1154. In the RSE calculation, just a very a big picture idea of the RSE calculation is the difference in the risk score, 1168 versus 1154. We think we're getting that benefit for 3 years at the cost of $1 million, gives you a RSE of 42. Now, there is more to it. There's some discounting where appropriate. You discount future benefits, and there's some things you do with the cost, but this is a character of how we want to do RSEs in the future. And like I said, those will be things carried out in the next few months. I'd like to do one more slide, and then we can pause for questions for this entire section. So I believe Ed's team or Fred's team sent out some issues that they wanted to discuss, and this focuses on some of those, on 2 of those. And I'm going to read a little bit from this, but which I hate doing, but the subject matter experts, SMEs, we prefer to use quantitative data, real data. That's how we run the company, but there are times when that's not available, or it needs to be interpreted, or it needs to be determined when to use what data. So we try not to use pure SME input, but SMEs are definitely involved in helping us find the data, or helping us to figure out how to apply it. Second bullet there is we don't just take SME input and write it down and say we're good to go. The Enterprise Risk Management Team, that's what ERM stands for, Enterprise Risk Management Team, looks at all the SME data. We are in the room when they make their case. We're answering their emails. We say things like, how do you know this? Why do you think that's true? We run it through, we calibrate it to some extent. So we just didn't want to give people the impression that, if some business unit says the number 3, and we just write down 3 and we're done. That's not how it works. And then the final bullet is when non-utility specific data is used, we will use some SME input to try to encourage some more internal numbers. So there are events that are not as frequent locally, and so we use external data and we use SMEs to try to help manage how to incorporate that data. So that's the SME conversation. And then the tranches is a subdivision of, from one aspect, it's a subdivision of assets, but when you get it down to the mitigation level, it's more appropriate to talk about it. It's easier to talk about it from a mitigation standpoint. So for example, I'll give an example. Maybe one of our activities is to replace fuses. A tranche is, well, does the company think that all fuses are the same, right? And clearly we don't. So if we knew internally, if we had risk profiles that show that these types of fuses were different than these types of fuses, we would probably come up with two different programs. I'm giving a very simple example. Imagine there's two different kinds of fuses that have different risk profiles. We would try to target mitigations with different numerics for each of the groups, and we call those tranches. So that allows us to determine where do we spend the money in the right place. So that's how we think of a tranche. And as I said before, when we go through the process with the business units and we talk about these 400 or 500 mitigations, each one we ask, is there a tranching opportunity here? Is there a room to divide up the analysis into those buckets so that we can more accurately reflect where to prioritize the work? An example I always give is, we have poles. We have wood poles and we have steel poles. If somebody just, sort of naively said, we want to go replace poles, and they didn't care which pole it was, we might be pulling out steel poles. So as an example, in our pole replacement work, we definitely break down steel poles and we break it apart from wood poles, and we go even more refined than that. We talk about the age of the pole and all sorts of things. So we're not only following the settlement agreement, it's like, I think we go well above the requirement and to try to define those buckets, because we don't want to spend money where we don't need to spend money. We want to focus it on things that bring the most risk reduction.
Mason, this is Ed Arkovich. I appreciate that you're trying to address these questions that were raised previously. With regard to tranches, and you started off talking about mitigations and how to best apply your mitigations and focus them based on your criteria. So then that begs the question, and it's probably baked into this, but I'd like you to talk about it, how you segment your risks. Using your pole example, yes, there's a difference between steel and wood poles, but there's also poles that are in a high fire risk area, which might be at greater risk than, say, wood poles in a low fire risk area. Do you segment your risks in that fashion so that drives your decisions on how to apply your mitigation money?
Yes, sir, we definitely do. We for the electric infrastructure, we have basically two large risks. One is called electric infrastructure integrity, which pretty much focuses on all electric concepts that are not wildfire. And then the second, we have another risk called wildfire risk. And then that one does focus on the HFTD and things that lead to wildfire implications. There are things in the HFTD that don't have wildfire implications. We do have underground system in the HFTD. Those don't have as much wildfire implications. And we think of those reliability issues in the EII chapter instead. So from that regard, I'm getting some feedback here. Anyway, kind of distracting.
Folks, if you're not raising your hand to ask a question, could you mitigate your phones? I'll have to go through the list of people and start mitigating that noise by muting your phones. Thank you. So is it possible then that when you file your RAMP, we'll be able to correlate the RSCs and the segmentation of the risk to the actual tranches of mitigation that you're proposing?
Oh yeah, definitely. The RSCs will be presented basically in the tranche format. So you'll be able to see all that hopefully spelled out. And just as an aside, and I know this is not a wildfire necessarily meeting specifically, but in our wings development that we're undertaking, at least at SDG&E, we've created 580 tranches, as it were, and each one will have its own RSE, and each one will have a impact from wildfire risk and the PSPS impacts. So little sneak preview there.
Wow, I'm excited to take a look at that. And I'll let others ask questions at this time. I see Charles Feinstein has his hand raised, and then Tom Long in that order.
Thank you, Ed. My question to you, Mason, is about the tranching. I understand what you just said, and I understand the discussion you just had with Ed, but I find that the emphasis on mitigations with respect to tranching is probably not the best way to think about it, I believe. I believe that a tranche should be composed of system assets that have the same or very similar likelihoods of occurrence and very similar consequences for occurrences for a given risk event. And so that means the tranches should be based on the risk event, and they should be a decomposition of the assets in the system. The mitigation is applied to the tranche, and whether it's useful or not is another story. But that oughtn't be the way that a tranche is specified.
Yeah, I think the way you said it is basically how we do it. The issue, Dr. Feinstein, is that if you pre-tranche by asset, and you say, let's just start there and divide all of our assets into tranches, you lose some resolution on mitigations. And that's why, and I'll get into that, that's why we think it's appropriate to when you look at the mitigation, then you determine which assets are applicable to that, and you tranche from there. I know that those might sound a little different, but in the end, I think they get you to the exact same place. So let me mention why tranching at the asset level is and doing it at the beginning is not necessarily the best way to. Okay, so there are a lot of activities that occur at the utilities that go beyond tranches. So, for example, labor costs we don't track by assets, by tranches of assets. So, for example, we have, an engineering team might be looking at pipeline, and they're not necessarily dividing their time up by when they work on that type of pipe or that type of pipe. Secondly, inspections are done across the gamut. So when inspectors go out and look for things, they have a list of things to look for, and therefore they're not looking at things from an asset tranche standpoint. Other things like that are construction standards, where those are also blend across. And so, for example, when we go replace a piece of pipeline or we replace a line of poles, we don't only replace like a tranche of it. We replace all the poles, all the wire. Like if we're doing a overhaul, we do all the poles, all the wires, all the transformers, all the fuses, and it kind of goes beyond the tranche perspective from an asset level. However, we think we're getting to the same point that you're asking by saying, hey, what do you plan on doing with that asset? And then let's make sure that you're thinking of the asset in the tranche perspective when it's time to do the analysis. And like you said, we are definitely looking at groups of assets that have similar likelihoods and consequences if they were to fail, but we don't establish that necessarily until we're looking at the mitigation, because like I just said, for the inspections and the labor and the construction, it blends across and it makes things more complicated. I hope that's understood, and I hope that makes sense, and I'd be happy to talk more about it if you want.
I understand what you said. Thank you.
This is Tom. I really want to echo the point Chuck was just making, and do it a different way. I think Chuck hit on something really important. I think this slide's discussion under the heading of tranches is collapsing two related but different concepts. There's the overarching concept of granularity. So granularity is good. More granularity is good. And this has been a big problem with the PG&E ramp. That's probably been the number one issue that parties have been raising about PG&E's ramp presentation. But there are two ways that granularity needs to, the analysis needs to be granular. One is with respect to the presentation of mitigations. Families of mitigations, et cetera, not good. Program by program, good, better, right? So that's one issue, granularity of mitigations. And then, Mason, you were suggesting with fuses that, and this would be good too, that if there's two different kinds of fuses, they should be separate mitigations. They shouldn't be put together as the same mitigation, because the different kinds would likely have different impacts on risk reduction. So they should be analyzed separately. So that's one side of granularity. But the other side of granularity is the tranches. And tranches, as Chuck is saying, has to do with how you break down the assets into groups. And those groups, and I want everyone to keep this in mind, it's row 14 of the settlement. Please put that in your notes and underscore it. Row 14 of the settlement is very, very clear on how tranches are to be established. And the last sentence says, for the purposes of the risk analysis, each element, i.e. asset or system, contained in the identified tranche would be considered to have homogeneous risk profiles, i.e. considered to have the same lore and core. That's how a tranche is to be defined. If you have a group of assets that have, you're trying to say that they should be viewed as one tranche, but they have different lores, they should not be the same tranche. If they have different cores, they should not be the same tranche. Those assets need to be further broken down until you get groups that have the same lore and the same core. Are we in accord on that, Mason, or do we have a difference?
No, 100%. I thought I said the same thing. So yeah, thank you for, yeah.
Okay, good. All right. But I do really think, Chuck, it's important to, I honestly didn't understand your answer to Chuck in terms of how we get to the same place, but you do it a different way. It worries me a little bit, because I think the settlement is clear that we do need to do it. You're saying this pre-identification thing is a bad idea. And I think that's exactly what the settlement requires. And I think it's a good idea. I think it's the right way to do it. And I think it's what we all contemplated in the settlement.
I think these are very good issues being raised, and I appreciate your input, Dr. Feinstein and Tom Long. Is there a way, Mason, that we can get more detail on an example to illustrate how Sempra is planning on presenting this in their May filing, so that we don't come to the May filing, look at it, and then have issues at that point? Is there some way we can assess in greater detail what you're saying, so that we can understand it and make sure we're all comfortable with it?
I definitely think there is a way to have those communications carried out. I think right now it's probably not the right time for that. So if our regulatory team and yourself and interested parties like Turn would like to have more information, I'm sure that we could make sure that happen.
I'll bring it up offline and we'll try to arrange something. And folks listening to this conversation, if you're interested in that follow-up, send me an email and I'll include you on the participation. I'm trying to avoid a full-on workshop, but if it comes to that, I'm happy to work that out.
Thank you, Ed. So I'll just say right now, this slide is the end of that section, and what follows is the break. So I'll be happy to take any more questions that are relevant to, to this section up to this point. And if not,
I have a question. Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. Can anybody help me with where the raise hand button is? I'm not seeing one on mine.
I don't see it either.
Okay. Well, I had a question about one of the slides. It had a statement that quantitative data is preferred, but shouldn't quantitative data be used where available? In other words, a preference sounds like you prefer it, but it's not a requirement. It implies that it's not a requirement when I think that it is. And then the other thing that I was wondering about is there was a statement about when non-utility specific data is used. And I wanted to find out if the companies have updated their approach from the 2019 RAMP, because one of the problems in that document was that there were instances where there was extensive utility specific data and it wasn't being used in the risk assessment at all. So I just wanted to make sure that that had been updated.
I guess I don't know which event you're talking about that where we had data that wasn't used, but yeah, we very much attempt to use, so for your first point, data where it's applicable. I think you know that sometimes data that's exactly related to what we're looking for might not be present, so we might use it as a proxy or we might use it as a guide. For example, some of the pipeline risks are so rare within our company, we go to PHMSA data, which we'll talk about more later. It's an external data source run by the government that talks about likelihoods and consequences of events if they were to happen. And occasionally we do reference that data, and then we will apply our own understanding of how to use it. We rarely would just take a number from outside source and say that's what we're using. We have to figure out how to apply it, and that kind of hits both the first and the third buttons. Bullets. Yeah.
That's an excellent example, and the one that first came to my mind, because what I saw from the 2019 RAMP was the use of PHMSA data to the exclusion of utility-specific data, where we have these detailed inline assessments, all kinds of inspections that are required that were just not used, and to the exclusion of generalized information from across the nation when we have actual information about the assets that we're talking about here that weren't being utilized.
Yeah, Melinda, I think we're trying to do every effort to do what you're suggesting, and there's a lot of times where data is used one way or another, and I think we keep getting better on when to apply particular data sources. So we appreciate the feedback, and if there are specific examples that you want to share, and this is being recorded, so I'll probably go back and listen to your ILI example. If you have more, please share them with us, and we will try to make sure either we did it for the right reason or we're maturing from that point in time.
Right, and along those lines, I assume that you already have the comments that the commission instructed the utilities to address from the prior RAMP. So do you need me to resend those, or?
No, if you're referring to those, that will be enough. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mason?
Yeah.
Chuck Feinstein, I have a question about the general nature of the MAVF. Are we going to return to that later in the discussion, or are you just going to do more examples and discuss different things?
I think this would be the time to go through the general nature of the MAVF.
All right, good, thank you. There was a discussion about upper bounds on the natural units, and I wanted to make 2 points. As I understand the settlement, there's no such thing as a bound on the natural units. The reason why there are upper bounds in the specification of the attributes is to facilitate weighting. But that doesn't mean that no outcomes can occur that exceed the upper bound. And in particular, if, for example, there were a financial outcome that was, say, $1,000 million, and your upper bound is 500 million, in your computations, you would report that as a 2, not as 1.
Correct. I think that's
I want to make that clear, because that means that you're extending the linear scaling functions in the natural way just by extending them out beyond the upper bound. And that is not what we have seen from PG&E. And I just wanted to be sure that you weren't doing the same thing that they're doing.
I think I understand your question, and I believe that we are doing it the way you've described that you would prefer us to do. Yes.
Well, it's the way the settlement, I'm not expressing a preference. I'm just saying that the settlement doesn't call for an upper bound or an upper limit for any purposes other than weighting.
Yeah, there is no bound in our math. That's for sure.
Thank you. That's very nice. Thank you very much.
Our math is unbounded.
I won't touch it.
Did I hear you say you had two questions, or was that?
No, that was the only one.
Okay. I'm looking at the clock, and I don't want to cut people off, but I think it would be time for a break, and we can follow up on anything if people want to hold. Is there any immediate questions people have right now?
Mason, this is Ed. I don't see any hands raised, but apparently that's not a function that everybody can utilize. So to your point, I think we can take any other questions related to this at the end of the workshop.
Okay, so the agenda as Joe, you handle this.
I think I'm unmuted. I might have been unmuted the whole time. I was petrified to make any noise. Yeah, the agenda we are basically one topic behind, if you will. We just finished the risk quantification overview, and I believe we still have the risk assessments topic. However, we're now at 11:45, which is what we would have designated as the end of the break. And so we had thought that we maybe, to the extent we were running late, we anticipated having a shortened break period instead of 30 minutes, probably 15 minutes. So Ed, what are your thoughts of having a 15-20-minute break? I've got 11:46. Resume at 12, come back at 12 o'clock, and have Mason pick up on the risk assessment topic?
I think that's appropriate, Joe. Thanks for that suggestion. So let's do that. Let's resume it at 12.
All right, thanks. And then I'm just from a logistics, does the recording just keep going during break, or how does?
I think it does. Let me check that out. Yeah, I can. Okay, folks, it's 12 o'clock, 12:01 by my computer. I'd like to start resumption of the workshop. So, Joe, if you're available, can you
Sure.
set that
Mason,
back up?
Yep.
Mason, are you available to continue the workshop at the risk assessment section?
Yes, sir.
I have the recording started, so let's resume.
So I think I'd like to do it where we get into the assessments, and then if there's questions about, the previous section, we can do that at the end, if that's fine. I want to keep the calendar moving a little bit. And Joe, actually, before we jump in, can you recycle the agenda thought, because it is 12 now. I just want to make sure, where are we going to carve the time off? Sorry, Joe.
Carve time off or add time to. Well, that is an option.
Yeah, I guess the very end, which was Q&A and wrap up, we can carve it out of there. Okay, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Joe. So before we get going, helping me with this section is Jeff Bunting. He's at SoCalGas, and I'd like to have him introduce himself if he's able to. And if not, okay, hey, Jeff.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Bunting. I work in the ERM department for SoCalGas, and I'm assisting Mason and team through this process. Nice to meet you.
And then I would also like to thank my business partners, Ramsey, Grant, Brian, Ankit, and Marcelo for helping out with this section as well. Okay, with no further ado, Ed, I think we're back from lunch, and let's get going. Okay, this is kind of the meat of why we're here. We went through, remember that we walked through the enterprise risk register items, and we did an assessment of them, and this is the result. So we're going to start with SoCalGas. And the way that we did the assessment was we did an annual safety score for each of the risks, and for all 14 of them. And then for those that had a non-zero, we looked at the top 40%. We said we need to, for the top 4 for SoCalGas, we also will show the reliability and the financial and trust numbers as well. And then we're giving the full MAVF. So on this slide, Joe, if you don't mind, if you could flash forward just one slide just to show that we're all 14 are here, and then maybe back, Joe. Thank you. I appreciate your cooperation. We're looking at all 14 risks, and each one has a safety score, and you can see it's sorted by the safety number, 0.94, 0.61, and so on. So these are the 14 risks in our enterprise risk register. They have a specific scope. This is what goes on internally at the company about the scoping of these risks. These risks are created and reviewed annually by the leadership team and the risk management groups. They have a specific scope in a document, so we know exactly what we're referring to. When, like Ed's earlier question about where does a pole land, is it in electric or is it in wildfire? That type of thing is scoped in that document. So we went about the safety assessment, getting it in the order that it's in. And then for the top 4 for SoCalGas, we proceeded on to do reliability, financial, and trust, as you can see. And then the final risk scores are shown. This is all part of the settlement agreement that the commission essentially wanted to ensure that we were looking at all risks and essentially capturing like how big, what's the magnitude of those risks, focusing on safety to ensure that a treatment of those was handled properly in the RAMP. We didn't want to leave any, large safety risks out of the RAMP. So that's the view here. Importantly, though, on the right side of the spreadsheet is the column called recommended inclusion in the RAMP. And I think people know that the utilities are not, there's no hard rules about what's in or out of the RAMP. And so this is our attempt to demonstrate, as of this moment, which risks we think should be in the RAMP. And so you can see a lot of them is either yeses or nos, and then there's a few caveats which we can get into. But Later, we summarize the yeses in another slide, but this is the risk assessment that we've undertaken. Of note, I will say that on lines 3 and 7, they are in the enterprise risk register. They are two separate risks. One is called dig in on the distribution system. The other one's dig in on the transmission system. For the purposes of the RAMP, we think it's better if we actually combine them into one RAMP chapter. The quantitative analysis around it and back to those tranching conversations will still be, I would say, tranched and thought of as where they have different risk profiles and where they have different, likelihoods and consequences. Those will still be separated out. But for the purposes of the RAMP, we think it's better if we combine those two chapters, and we can go into that later if anybody desires. And then there's also another note down here in risk number 9. It says cross-functional factor. I would like to hold the questions on cross-functional factor to a little bit later. We have a section on it, but essentially it's risks that are not as clear-cut and affect other risks, and we want to handle them in a particular way. And we'll get into that in a further segment. I think again, what I would like to do is I want to show SoCalGas and SDG&E, and then we can take some questions at the end. So this is just 4 slides, 2 for SoCalGas and then 2 for SDG&E. So very similar to how we did SoCalGas, same thing. We went through safety assessment, ranked it by the safety assessment, and took the top 40%. In this case, it's 6 risks, did the full MAVF workup on those, and that's displayed in the risk score. Also, you'll see that because SDG&E serves both gas and electric, we also have the same issue with we think it's better to combine the dig-in risks for the gas side. But I will note, sorry, Joe, one more. I will note that there is a risk that maybe some people haven't seen before, and so I'd like to call that out specifically. And that is the risk number 3, which is customer and public safety contact with electric equipment. And the specific scoping around that is that the equipment was operating and was constructed, just fine. Everything was okay, but for some reason or another, individuals, non-employees, got in contact with that equipment. It can be, third-party contractors working for private landowners who just happened to touch the line. It could be, we had an experience where the window washer just leaned his equipment back too far and hit the system. So that risk was, it kind of fell through the cracks a little bit to some extent. It's mostly focused on public awareness and making sure our construction standards do not make it easy for people to accidentally touch our system. But because it does have a significant safety impact to society, we wanted to include it. Again, I don't want to get into the specifics of it right now, but we think most of this is we're doing our job just right. We just want to make sure people don't get into our system. That's kind of the focus of it. We have had some, fatalities in the last few years from it. So we wanted the commission to know that that's going on, and we're doing our best to inform the commission the level, the magnitude of that. So that's that for the first slide. The second slide is, SDG&E has a few, we have 22. Most of them, or a lot of them on this slide are zero safety. You can see it's like cybersecurity, even though it's lower on the list from a safety standpoint, we still say yes, we do want to include cyber into the RAMP. And then 14, just like for SoCalGas, we want to include an IT concept of recoverability of critical technologies as a cross-functional. And then one more caveat is that the ERR risk of customer public safety after meter gas incident, we'd like to include that in the gas distribution chapter because there's so much linkage between that risk. Just to be clear, the customer public safety after meter gas incident, after meter means between the gas meter and the residence. So everything that happens like downstream or towards the customer from the meter, and things could be, their pilot light wasn't lit, appliances were not installed properly, gas turn on and turns off didn't happen properly, and those have their own incidents. For the RAMP, we want to combine those into the distribution system because there's just so much overlap. The labor is a lot of the same people and so forth. So This is the end of the risk assessment piece, and I will pause here for people to ask questions on those 4 slides.
Mason?
Hey, Wendy.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Can you go back to the previous slide? Actually, well, I'll ask one question here and then to the SDG&E. I have a couple of questions. I only joined now, so I apologize if some of this was covered earlier. But one thing I'm curious about is how you're dealing with gas versus electric reliability attributes. Like, I'm assuming, if I'm understanding right, you're doing separate comparisons for SoCalGas and separate for SDG&E. So in SoCalGas, I would assume the reliability is all gas reliability for that 20% attribute. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so then if you move to SDG&E, how are you dealing with it? Because it looks like you're dealing with both gas and electric. So how are you splitting the gas and electric reliability? And I apologize if you covered this earlier.
That's okay. In our risk quantification framework, or the MAVF, actually, Joe, for Wendy's sake, can we go back to slide? We could just do this real quick. That one right there is good. So at the bottom, Wendy, is the reliability sub-attribute index. And you can see where it says reliability index and it says SDG&E / SoCalGas. What we're saying there is the things that are left of the slash are SDG&E and the things that are right of the slash are SoCalGas. So there's 4 attributes in play, but if you move your eyes all the way to the right under weight, I'm blocking my camera, sorry. You'll see that SoCalGas only has 50% weighting on the gas curtailment and the meter loss of service, but SDG&E has an equal 25% weight for all 4 attributes. The attributes are explained as gas curtailment, which is basically the need to, or the lack of gas in the line, and sometimes non-core customers need to get curtailed. The second line, gas meter loss of service, is just that. It's when the end meter has an outage or it doesn't have gas going to it. And then the electric ones are the SAFE and the SAIDI. Does that help?
Yes, does that mean that, I believe your total MAVF reliability attribute was 20%? Is that right?
Yeah.
There? So does that mean for the electric, it's actually really 10% for the outage count and 10% for duration?
You can think of it that way. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Or no, is it actually 5 and 5?
Yeah, it's 5.
It's 5 and 5.
Yeah.
Because for SDG&E, it's going to be 5 and 5 for the other 2.
Right.
So can you explain how it makes sense when you're assessing the electric infrastructure and it really doesn't have a cross, you really have 2 lines of business in SDG&E. You have an electric line of business and you have a gas line of business that don't really, overlap in the sense of the operations. So how does it make sense to do that, to split that reliability analysis that way?
Yeah, you're right. There is no direct line. And actually, there's a lot of work done by industry experts about the value of electric service. There's not as much done for the gas service. So we made our best effort to say when gas meters or gas curtailment occurs, it has this much impact. And we related that to the electric only through this attribute. They're not directly related. So we said, if you do the math on these things, you can see, like, if this many meters go out, it has this much impact on the risk score. And if this many electric meters go out, it has this much impact. And we basically just said, that feels right. There's not that much research on that. So they are separate business lines. So on the gas risks, when we do estimates that say, due to this gas risk, how many meters might go out or how much curtailment might occur, we just run it through the MAVF and it gives us a score. And we think the current weighting is indicative of the values at the company and how much it impacts the customers. So there isn't really a handbook on how to do that. We made our best effort.
Okay, I appreciate that. Can we go on to your next slides, the SDG&E risk? What was it?
Okay. Thank you, Wendy.
Sure, thank you. This one. So my question on this slide is the first risk, the wildfires involving SDG&E equipment. Is this including assessing PSPS as a risk?
So I'm glad you asked, because we've had a lot of thought around that question. This particular value does not include the PSPS impacts. However, we do measure what we think the PSPS impacts are. So when it's time to do the RSEs for system hardening, we include the impacts from PSPS. That might sound, maybe I'm talking too fast, but this one does not, I'll just be straightforward. No, this does not include the PSPS portion. This is just the wildfire risk itself. However, when we do the mitigations and the RSE assessments for those mitigations associated to wildfire, we will include the impacts, the negative impacts from PSPS, such as the safety implications, reliability, financial, and trust from the PSPS portion. And I think, Wendy, you may have been present at our WINGS workshop where we talked about how we're looking at both of those things together for decision making. We want to lower, we kind of think of as you add them together and then you want to lower both of them. We think you have to look at them at the same time, and you can't treat PSPS like it's something else, and you can't treat wildfire like you have to think of them together. And so in the WMP, which is coming out next spring or late winter, and our RAMP, we intend to, at the RSE point, combine those two impacts. We think of the PSPS as sort of like a sub-risk to wildfire, as it were, and we're not treating it like, well, we can reduce all wildfire by doing PSPS because it itself has a negative risk impact. So we're trying to combine the two together. I hope that's clear. And this is, I'll just say this out loud and maybe my team will get mad at me, but this is an important topic. And I think the more people understand the way that we're doing it, I think it will illuminate the conversation, and we'll be happy to have further conversations about it before our RAMP. I think it's important enough to not wait and to just to understand how we're doing it. And then it's our opinion that at the SMAP, in the the next one coming up, we can have like this really drawn out conclusion. Like, is this the right way to do it? So we'd like some understanding before the RAMP, but then the SMAP is the place to tackle, like, the restructuring of how to think about wildfire risk in general.
Thank you for that, Mason. I also would like to ask about the congruence with this approach in your wildfire mitigation plan and the synchronization of that with your RAMP filing.
Yeah, Ed, I personally am in very close contact with the WMP team. ERM in general is very close to the WMP team. And what we've come up with is that we want to do the WMP work first, and then using RAMP principles and settlement agreement principles, because that gets filed first. And then basically for the RAMP, almost copy and paste the concepts and the findings and the conclusions from the WMP and use them in the RAMP. There's not enough time in between the WMP filing and the RAMP filing to do something dramatically different, and we didn't want to confuse anybody with any growth that we've had. So we're doing our darndest, I don't know if I can say that, to get the WMP stuff ready by its window, and then just use that in the RAMP. So there will be complete synchronicity between the two filings, at least in the year 2021.
Thank you.
So I appreciate, Mason, you talking about it. Is there any possibility that SDG&E could send out a slide or two explaining what you explained to us about the way you're thinking to have PSPS as a subset to this? I think it's that important. It would be really helpful.
Yes, I totally agree. And yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question here, or I think it is, I just want to understand, I think I understand, the customer and public safety contact with electric equipment. Basically, is that kind of what you might call third-party safety risk for the electric side? And then you're doing it separately for the gas side, third-party safety risk. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's kind of analogous to the gas dig-in risk. Most dig-in is not done by our people. It's done by third-party contractors or even private landowners. And so it's a little bit similar to that, in that it's the outside party, getting into our system unintentionally, of course. There obviously are differences. When on the overhead electric side, you can see everything. On the pipeline side, you don't really know what's underneath, and you have the obligation to call in a check. So there's some analogies there. That's not a perfect parallel, but we had noticed in the past few years that people were getting into our system more frequently than maybe people had realized. And we just wanted to make sure that you all were aware that that was going on. And we are making attempts through communications and through our construction design standards to ensure that it's not getting worse and that you all know that it's happening. It's very traumatic when people get into our system and maybe it's just out of ignorance on their own part. Maybe they don't know that the wire will kill you as soon as you touch it. Maybe they don't know that. So we're reaching out from that perspective, and we don't really think we're necessarily doing anything wrong on our part. We think all of our stuff is built to code, but just public awareness is we can't let the ball drop on that one.
And does contact with electrical equipment basically include electrocution, electric shock, and also arc flash injuries?
It does. It's all of that, but the proviso is that it's intact equipment. This is not like the wire failed and it's on the ground and then somebody comes and touches it. That would be in the electric infrastructure integrity, because there is an integrity issue with the wire first. This is strictly intact of those things you just mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. I appreciate your questions, Wendy.
I have one more question I would like to ask. I would like to ask one more question. I forgot. The next slide, Mason?
Just one question.
Yes, one more. I noticed the electric grid failure and restoration. What is that?
That is when the entire grid goes black because of outside transmission and generation issues. You can think of it as the entire transmission grid having a failure. It doesn't necessarily have to be the entire SDG&E grid, for example. It could be just large portions of it, and that's what that represents.
Thank you.
Okay, Melinda, now's your chance.
Thank you. I would like to see climate change, please. That is the biggest risk we face, and I think it needs to be on there. It was on the first ramp. It was removed from the 2019 ramp. Please put it back on.
Yeah, Melinda, we agree. It will be in the ramp. Our proposal is to treat it as a cross-functional factor with very high importance in the ramp. And very briefly, we will talk about cross-functional factors, but we are certainly including that concept into the ramp. We'll get into it, but I'll just say for right now, it as a climate change thing, it affects multiple business units and multiple risks in interesting ways. And rather than treating it as its own risk, we wanted to give you the comprehensive view of how it's affecting and how it's cross-functionally affecting other risks. So it's not technically a ramp chapter in itself, but it is definitely in the ramp. And we'll get into more of that soon.
If I could just raise a follow-up on that, what I saw was lost in, is that a different approach from what was taken in the 2019 ramp? Because what I saw was lost from the 2016 to the 2019 ramps were the utilities taking responsibility for their contributions to climate change impacts. That was what was lost, and that is an important thing that we can't lose sight of.
Okay, I would definitely say it's a development since the 2019 ramp. That's for sure.
Okay.
And I would say, Melinda, if you don't get the satisfaction from when we get to that cross-functional factor section, please continue to ask questions. Yeah. Any other questions on these four slides? Okay. Thank you, Joe. Let's move on to, this is a summary of this is a summary of the risks that we believe SoCalGas should have in the ramp. To Melinda's point, in addition to those cross-functional factors, which will be discussed shortly. It's 7 risks. And I want to point out again that if you see the third one there from the top on the left, it says dig in on the distribution and transmission systems. It's kind of a grouped chapter for the distribution and transmission system risks. So that's the 7 that we're recommending right now. Pending feedback from SoCalGas's ramp, and SDG&E's is these following 9. There's obviously an overlap between They both have employee, they both have contractor, they both have cybersecurity. I'm talking about between SoCalGas and SDG&E. And then they both have, because SDG&E also serves gas, they both have the pipeline risks in there as well. What's unique to SDG&E is the wildfire, the electric infrastructure, and the contact with electric equipment. And what's unique to SoCalGas is the storage. Yeah, so that gives you kind of like a rundown of the risks we're proposing to have. That's actually a really short section. So are there any questions on these two slides? Okay, thank you, Joe. So we wanted to walk through some examples of how we are going to go about looking at how we calculated the risk scores and how we're thinking about the process in general. So the first example is a SoCalGas risk called dig-in on the distribution system. And as before, I'd like to get through the 4 slides for SoCalGas, and then I can take questions, and then we have an SDG&E example after that, but I'll take questions in between the two. So, you know, as a reminder, we do risk assessments at the risk level as defined by the enterprise risk registers. So we're looking at basically all risk events that occur in the dig-in space for the distribution system. And believe it or not, there's a lot of different reasons that dig-ins occur. And there's a lot of different consequences that occur from dig-ins. Some dig-ins, they barely scratch the pipe, they realize they scratched the pipe and they stop their work and then they go for help. Other dig-ins have, you know, very bad consequences associated to them. So the risk is broken down into 3 sub-events. One are the incidents that do have either a fire, an explosion, or a safety incident. A safety incident as defined by serious injury or worse. Then there's low consequence incidents where it's still a consequence. There may be some gas escaped the system, maybe some meters lost service for whatever reason. Sometimes they have to turn some valves to shut it off, and then those meters downstream can lose service. And then there's also a part of the distribution system called the supply line. If you have any questions on that, Jeff can be happy to answer them for you. It's essentially a larger capacity line that feeds the distribution. So it's a little bit different type of asset to some extent. So we looked at like what events happen on those 3 systems. Then we looked at where can we get the data from. And as we were talking earlier with Melinda and others, the data comes from all different sorts of areas. We've got lots of internal data. So I say combination of national and company data is used. And I'm showing here the national data. PHMSA is a primary source. So one way we use the PHMSA data is on occasion, we need to get it for those rare events to figure out what kind of impacts they had. And I actually have a note here from Christine Wong, who happens to be the best analyst out there. She'd sent me a note earlier. I was going to look at it. The way we use the data is we try to, sometimes we get the consequence data from the PHMSA, but we use our internal incident rate. Depends on the scenario, because there's some situations where we have those events occur internally, but there wasn't enough of them to like just lean on them from one perspective. So we wanted to add to the conversation by looking at some national data as well. So we looked at an incident rate for each of the sub-events, and then we came up with a distribution for the consequences that could occur, which is also a combination of looking at national and internal data as appropriate. And then we ran the Monte Carlo simulation. You know, basically you roll the dice, you say, we think it's going to happen X amount of times a year, and that is probabilistic. How many times a year does it happen? We roll the dice on that, and then we know how many times it's going to happen. Then we roll the dice on the consequences to say, well, how bad was it on that particular event? So we do random draws from probability distributions that are created through a mix of historical, internal, and national data to do 10,000, essentially 10,000 years of run. And then we look at what is the total amount of consequence in terms of safety, reliability, financial, and trust for each of those years. And then for the purposes of the work, we use that to calibrate the core and the lower. We can do the core first through the Monte Carlo, and then we do the lower. There's all sorts of ways to do it. So settlement agreement, we follow that. We determine the lower through probabilistic means. We determine the core through probabilistic means in this case, and then we multiply those together to get the risk score. I know that's a lot of talking, but that goes into how we did the risk score for SoCalGas dig-in. And Joe, let's move to the next slide here. It's a little bit faint, but what we're showing here is this is like a dashboard of the data that we're using. And this one comes from the PHMSA database where all the incidents occurred. And this just helps us to kind of get a handle on where the data is, what type of event it is. If you could see in true dashboard fashion, you can turn off and on some of these things. And hazardous event, again, was there a fire or was there an explosion? And then the injury or fatality, another one. So we can tweak these, we can get the data from it and apply it to the particular usage as it fits. PHMSA calls their risk excavation damage. So you can see on the lower right, there's 150 nationwide excavation damages that were hazardous incidents. Just wanted to kind of just generally show you about some of the data in a graphical way. I hope you can see the map. That's the United States with and Canada with some dots on it. Joe, next slide, please. So here's some examples of the way we modeled the safety, the financial, and the reliability. Dr. Feinstein, you might be interested to know that we did run these kind of two different ways. One was from an annual pass, and another one was through the lower and core directly, kind of as a calibration, make sure we were thinking about everything the right way. In the end, for our numbers, we do use the lower and the core method, but we use this as a calibration technique as well. So what we're showing here is in a given year, what do we think the annual likelihood of people getting hurt is? And we put it into buckets. And I just want to walk through that real briefly to show you what kind of analysis that we've undertaken. In this top table called annual likelihoods, where it says safety unit 10 plus, and it's got the weird bracket on the side. It's a math way to say it's greater than 10 or more. The likelihood of that happening in a given year is very low. It's basically zero. The odds of, the outcome of 3 to 10 people dying actually is 0.02. So about 2% of our years, we think. So you can kind of get a feel for like the likelihood on an annual basis of how big the risk will be. In the end, when we say the expected value is every year 0.3 safety units, that's not as informative because you could get the idea, well, maybe there's 0.3 people getting hurt every year. But when you see it this way, you can say, oh, like for example, Joe, do you have access to the mouse? Can you like highlight stuff? Is that possible? I usually do these with a pointer. Yeah, thank you, Joe. Joe, if you could go to the right where it says 0 and 0.69. What that means is 69% of the years, we don't think anybody's going to get hurt. So it's just information to pass along, like how big, what's the range of of the outcomes that could happen. So that's available to you. And then the bottom table shows on an annual expected value, how much financial, how many meters are out a year, and so forth. So that's kind of an annual view. And then to the settlement agreement view, which is exact same numbers, just portrayed a slightly different way. Joe, if you could go to the next slide. We do what is the average consequence? Oh, and here's a reminder. The core equals, you take the attributes, you feed it through the risk quantification framework. And then the way you get your risk score is you take the core and you multiply it by the lower. And yes, this does have the frequency issue in it. So hopefully we can get past that for now. But the way the core looks here is that we said, what is the consequence for gas distribution dig-ins if the event were to occur? And so for when it occurs, we think there's 0.0001 SIFs, and you can read the rest, per event. And remember how I told you earlier that there's 3 kind of events we were looking at: the high consequence, the low consequence, and the supply line. This is a weighted average of all those because we do things at the risk level. So this is a weighted average of the consequence of the risk events. So you take those inputs, we showed it in red, and then you take that to the MAVF and you run it through the MAVF, the risk quantification framework. I know it's boring math, but it's the same as we showed earlier. You divide it by the range. Because we're doing things linearly, it's pretty straightforward. You divide it by the range, you multiply by the weighting, and you do that over and over again for each of the attributes. And then again, we multiply by 100,000 to make it more human readable. And the core turns out to be 1.09. The lower is 2,914, and not to get into that whole likelihood and frequency debate, I don't want to focus on that, but that's how many events there are a year on the SoCalGas system for distribution and dig-ins. There's a lot of dig-ins out there. There's a lot of events. And so this is how many there are in a given year. And so the way we're doing the math right now is we're multiplying that lower by that core, and you can see below it gives you a risk score. And sorry, I sound like Dr. Seuss when I say core, lower, and risk score, giving you 3,171. Okay, so that concludes the SoCalGas example. If anybody's still awake, feel free to ask questions. Okay, hearing none, we can go to the. Oh, hey, Chuck.
I have a question for you, please.
Okay.
On the slide 31, I see that safety is 0.0001 SIFs. What's on slide 30, please? Is the 0.3 related to the 0.001?
Yeah, that's when you do it the annual way. So if you multiplied the one by the other, you'd get 0.31. So we're showing two different views. I think the math should be, because they are doing the exact same. Yeah, I was hearing some feedback. Was somebody talking?
I understand what you were saying. Point is the value of the safety distribution.
Yeah, Dr. Feinstein, I think your audio is breaking up a little bit. I didn't hear all the words.
I'm sorry, I do not understand the relationship between the 0.31 on page 30, 0.0001 on page 31.
Yeah, so from a settlement agreement, the focus should be on this slide right here. But if you want to know what the 0.31 came from, it's essentially the 2,914 events per year multiplied by the per event, if it were to happen, 0.001. If you multiply those together, you would get the 0.31. Because the previous slide is an annual view, and there's just some rounding going on with the numbers. Dr. Feinstein, your audio, I was only hearing like every third word, so I hope I answered your question. Can others hear?
Mason, it might help if you mute when he's talking. It might help.
Okay, I'll get my finger on the mute button.
I think what he's asking is, on slide 30, you show a value of 0.31 for your expected value, and the annual consequences listed below. But then you come over to slide 31 and you're showing the safety value as 0.0001. And it's not clear how these examples are related to each other. And if they aren't, then it would probably be helpful if you used an example that had continuity from the prior slide.
Yeah, these are completely in line with each other. The settlement agreement is slide 31. It's what are the consequences per risk slide 31. Yeah, this is the settlement agreement version of how to do stuff. The settlement agreement says, calculate the core. If a risk event were to happen, how bad would it be? Calculate the likelihood, which we're interpreting to be the frequency of how many events happen per year. So the math that we're doing is the risk score equals the lower times the core gives you 3171. To Dr. Feinstein's question, what's the relationship between the safety shown here is on slide 30 is an annual view of how many people will get hurt in a given year. And that number is the same, which is how many people get hurt per year multiplied by how many events there are per year, which is 2,914. So if you took that number right there, multiplied it by that, you would get the 0.31 from the previous slide.
Clarify, please. Could you return to slide 30? Please tell me what the safety attribute is in the box to the left of the table?
Is that the one that Joe's circling?
Yes.
I believe that is the annual safety. It's a pretty graph for the presentation, but it's the annual safety implications to distribution dig-in, and it's a communication tool to ourselves and the commission to show that there's a lot of variety in the outcomes in a given year. It can range from 0 all the way to 10 deaths, basically, and that's a demonstration of that. That is not core and lower. It's just more information for the commission to understand the kind of risks that we have in front of us.
Hey, Mason, isn't the graph to the left just a graph of the table of data that you show to the right?
I believe so. So just to be clear, slide 30 is not the settlement agreement requirement. Slide 31 is. So I just want to make sure we were giving more information above and beyond what the settlement agreement calls for by sharing with the commission what kind of distribution of deaths we expect from distribution dig-in gas. And some years, 69% of the years, we don't expect any safety. 17% of the years, we expect 0 to 1 safety units, and then you can go from there. It's just additional information so that people can understand the distribution of the risk. It's not part of the settlement agreement, it's additional information.
So this is Tom. I have a different question, and it relates to slide 28. And this is about how you, it's a little bit going to the data, and it's also revisiting the point I was trying to make earlier about the baseline. So when you are considering the dig-in risk, you want to be thinking about the state of at least for your analysis that's going to be in the GRC, you want to be thinking about what's the state of the risk as we enter the test year. So you would want to know, you want to take into account all of the mitigation work that had been done prior to the beginning of the 2024 test year in order to know, to be able to understand the state of that risk. Are we following each other on that point?
I follow your words, yes.
Okay, right. So then the question becomes, what data did you use to determine, and just to try to make it clear, the point is, let's say, hypothetically, that Sempra engaged in a major mitigation activity to really lessen the dig-in work, and then that was an activity that was happening from 2021 through 2023 because it was approved in the last rate case. And it was like Sempra intensifying its efforts at education, pouring more time and effort into locate and mark, et cetera, in order to really, really work hard at mitigating dig-in. And that was going to have some lasting impacts. Well, we would want to take that into account in deciding what the riskiness, what the state of the risk of the dig-in. So now the data question. So what was the data that you were using? And I think it was using data from like 2020 or something, not taking that data and then recognizing that the mitigation work and doing an estimate of the improvement to the risk situation that was going to occur with the additional work that the Sempra utilities would be doing up through the end of 2023. So again, that's the baseline issue. What data did you use?
For this, we used internal and historical data that was up to as recent as we could find it. And to your point, Tom, I think I'll answer directly. We did not do any calibration that accounted for what might the risk be at a certain time in the future. And I appreciate your point of view on that. I would say those conversations are above my pay grade to some extent to how we exactly handle that. So I would appreciate we defer those questions from me on that point. For
Okay,
later,
that's totally fine. I'm sorry to interrupt. That's totally fine with me. I just wanted to make sure my issue was understood. The issue I was raising earlier was understood, and I thought this was an example, an opportunity to do it. Okay, so thank you.
Yep. Okay, so that's the SoCalGas example. The SDG&E example is very similar. In this case, we're looking at the employee safety at SDG&E. We looked at company data you can see from 2015 to now. I think now means we actually did incorporate some of the 2020 data. It's not always up to the last minute though. We looked at the type of incident rate that we see to employees. And then we created some probability distributions around those consequences to get an understanding of what they might look like. But for purposes of core and lore, we do just take the expected value of those right now. The Monte Carlo for this purpose is to let the internally and the commission understand the kinds of ranges of outcomes we might get. So we took the 0.88 incident rate per year. We ran it through some Poisson. We looked at that and we came up with some annual outcomes. But in the end, the core is just using the expected value, and then the lore is using the expected value as well. So let's go to the next slide. This is a view of what you get in a given year. Again, this is not the settlement agreement core lore version. This is in a given year, what do we expect to have happen probability-wise to our employees? And it shows the range of, in this case, about 40% of a years, they don't have any, not even a serious injury. But then you have incidents whenever you see a 1 or higher, that means there was probably a fatality involved. In the end, the math shows using the core and lore way also is every year is about 0.35 expected value in a given year. So going into the settlement agreement method and slide, well, actually, this is more of a highlight. I don't want to get stuck on this because there we go. Let's just go to that. The core and lore settlement agreement version is per risk event, 0.4 SIFs per event, no reliability impacts. This is the same math as earlier in the presentation. Wendy wasn't here for that, so it would be good to see it again. Those are the assumptions that per event, if it happened, it would be those. Then how many events happen in a year, 0.9, multiply those together, get a risk score of 1168. So you've kind of seen that a little bit before, but that's the settlement agreement way of doing it. Figure out how bad the event is, the expected value of those events if they were to happen at the risk level. Put the core through the MAVF to get a score, multiply by, in our case, the frequency, and that's your risk score. Any questions on the SDG&E example?
This is Wendy.
Yeah, hi, Mason. This is Fred. You probably mentioned this already. The meaning of SIF is significant injury or fatality.
Serious injury or fatality.
So in my mind, I would say that's the same thing as what PG&E is calling their EF, equivalent fatality. It's assigning a fractional fatality to a serious injury, and then the number 1 to every fatality. You add those up, and PG&E calls that the equivalent fatalities. I think it looks like it's the same number.
I think that's probably how they're using it, but we are only using it in terms of fatality as a 1 and serious injury as a 0.25. I don't know if they're adding any other versions of health impacts into their mix, but yeah, the math sounds the same as long as the 2 inputs are the same. Yep.
This is Wendy. So, can you hear me, Mason?
Hi, Wendy. Yes.
Okay. First, I want to ask: is the employee safety for both gas and electric incidents that could impact employee safety?
For SDG&E, it is. For SoCalGas, obviously, it's just the gas employees. Yeah.
Okay. And second, how would you address in the way that you're doing the modeling for SDG&E if there is, for example, an employee that is, God forbid, but electrocuted or something, and there was a reliability impact, where perhaps, there was, an outage or something, and it was kind of at the same time as that incident. How would you address that?
Yeah, that's a good point, Wendy. I was kind of hoping nobody would notice because there are rare cases where that could happen. It's our opinion that if that were to happen, the reliability would be fairly low. And those things together, we didn't want to make it seem like a employee safety thing was a reliability issue. To us, it's 99%, if not more, the math would come from the safety part. So we just treated the reliability as zero. We didn't want to give our employees the impression we don't want them to get hurt because we want to keep the lights on, right? I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, what perhaps when you file, or you could explain that more, the thinking. I mean, I think I can understand, because usually in the electric side, the protection system would come into play, and it would probably you might be able to prevent an outage by switching over to another not in all cases, but you might just explain that maybe.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's swig some Pepsi here. I thought I saw another hand up. Is that not true? I don't want to cut anybody off. But okay.
Mason, I think Dr. Feinstein had his hand up. Thought he had a question, but maybe it's an old hand up.
It's an old one. Sorry, I kept it up.
Yeah, again, there's time at the end if new questions arise. I think that concludes that section, and that might conclude my portion. Just in general, it's been a pleasure talking to you guys. I'll be around to answer questions, but thank you for listening to me whine on about this.
Well, Mason, I do have one small clarification question related to the differences between the SoCalGas and the SDG&E. I might have misheard you, but I got the impression that you were using the expected value for the core and in the SDG&E, but you were using the settlement agreement calculation methodology for the SoCalGas. Did I misunderstand?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. No, it's identical in nature. We're using the settlement agreement for both utilities, using the core and lower. Expected value is, excuse me, it is part of the core and lower framework of the settlement agreement. So sorry if I confused terms, but yeah, no difference in the methodologies between the utilities.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
And before you go, Mason, can I ask when you think you might be able to send a slide or two explaining your PSPS as a subset? I mean, the sooner the better would be helpful.
Yeah, if we were in person, Wendy, I'd be looking over to Jamie York right now, and she'd be hand signing some amount of time. I can't really do that right now. I think by the end of this call, we'll have the answer for that. If you can wait, Wendy, so I'll pose the question on a chat system, and then hopefully we can get the answer before the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I might not be here, but others can let me know. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Jeff. Somebody give a thumb up that they can hear me at least. I'll head a nod up. Hopefully the folks can hear me. All right. As I said, I'm Joe McCauley. For those of you who do not know me, I am a program manager on Sempra's GRC team, and I will be providing an overview of the next three topics. As we were running late, a fair amount of some of my topics have already been discussed. Again, one of my topics is lessons learned and how we will be addressing them. I think probably half of them we've already had a discussion on, to the extent people want to continue having a discussion, and if time allows, I think that might be appropriate. But again, in the effort of time, we'll go through my slides, and then to the extent people have new questions, we can address them there. As was mentioned earlier, anticipated changes to the RAMP. There is one main change that we are anticipating and looking forward to doing, and that is cross-functional factors. And so what are cross-functional factors? Well, we've identified initiatives that could be drivers, consequences, and/or mitigations that are related to safety and are associated with ramp risks, but not necessarily associated with any one ramp risk. A few instances of cross-functional factors may also be risks that are in the enterprise risk register, and then also activities that are not associated one-on-one with risks that are in the enterprise risk register. We've identified 8 so far, and those 8 are in alphabetical order: asset management, climate change adaptation and natural forces, emergency preparedness and response, information technology resiliency, pandemic, records management, safety management systems, and workforce planning qualified workforce. And if you remember some of the slides Mason had gone over earlier, where we had the enterprise risk register risks, and we identified over on the right-hand side cross-functional factors. Information technology is one of those, and I think there might have been another one. So again, those are the factors. I'm on the wrong slide. There we go.
Can I ask a question real quick, on those previous?
Real quick, yep.
Are there any large risk reductions to wildfire risk that you expect from any of these cross-functional factors? I mean, any significant reductions to risk, wildfire risk?
We have, you're asking if we've performed any of the quantitative analysis of the impact of any of these factors, and we have not. We're not at that point yet.
I will add, I know you thought you were done with me. I will add that on the contrary, we think climate change is making the wildfire worse. So that will be part of the discussion in that section.
Okay, I'll be specific to what I'm curious about is the emergency preparedness and response in particular, and whether that is forecast, whether you guys are expecting it to forecast to reduce wildfire risk or not. It's just something to consider.
And Wendy, one of the reasons we're having these in its own chapter, the cross-functional factors will be in their own chapter, and one of the reasons we're treating them that way is because they have impacts across multiple risks, and to that extent, there may be challenges identifying which aspect of the emergency preparedness and response is specific to wildfire relative to employee safety, relative to any of the other risks that they may have a portion influencing. And so some of these, we may show its overall value and not identify how much of that value is specific to any subsequent risk. And in that manner, we're identifying this factor has multiple activities that affect and involve the crossover multiple risks. We feel it's important to identify its, if you will, holistic value, and it's just really a challenge parsing it out amongst 2 or 3 or 4 different ones.
Okay, so you're not planning to apply it to the other specific risks. You're planning at this point to keep it separate.
We are in the state of gathering data, and to the extent we then review that data, and is that data cross-functional, applicable to other chapters, or is it really more applicable to be in one risk? Those are all things that are still to be determined.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
To add on to that, it sounds like it's difficult to parse out the specific benefits or impacts of these cross-functional factors in a way that can meaningfully be calculated and quantified with respect to a specific risk. Is that?
Yes, I think that's fair. The sum of the parts, I don't think would fully show the value of the totality, if that's.
And the fact that some of these may be synergistic with each other, and a qualified workforce is better at handling emergency preparedness and responding to emergencies. And so there are synergistic impacts that might be important to know about, but how do we assess that with regards to the mitigations and the overall risk spend efficiencies?
Yes.
I guess I just want you to consider doing that if there is some data that could support it. PG&E has done that with emergency response, I believe, as a cross-functional factor, into showing the impact to reduce some of the risk for the wildfire risk, so I'm just bringing it up because I'm seeing it in another utility analysis.
Sure.
Well, I don't mean to say that it shouldn't be done. I'm not trying to diminish that request. I'm just pointing out that even if you do that, we may not be able to truly see a black and white quantification of the true benefits of some of these activities, even though you're attempting to try to quantify their impact on the mitigation. And I mean in a plus and a minus way. I don't mean necessarily that there's hidden benefits that we're not being able to quantify mathematically, but there also might be, we might run the risk of over quantifying a benefit because we don't fully understand all the intricacies of these different factors.
Thank you. So again, just going over this slide, and I think we've already mentioned some of it, by having a cross-functional factor chapter, it will allow for clear presentations in the RAMP of items in one place rather than trying to part and parcel them across multiple chapters. And this dedicated chapter will describe the factor, describe the associated controls and mitigations, map the controls and mitigations to the respective chapters, meaning we anticipate there being a table, and then within that table it will have the cross-functional factor and then identify which RAMP factors it has a connection to. And then when we look at those individual RAMP chapters, there will also be reference back to, all right, which cross-functional factors are, if you will, influencing it. And then we'll be summarizing the cost and the quantitative details.
Look, I think that's what I was meaning. Sorry about that, Joe. I think that's what what you're talking about, that you would be then taking the calculations, the RSE, the risk reduction calculations from this, and then mapping it into the RAMP chapters, the respective RAMP chapters. That's what you're saying, right?
We're using the word map. I'm not sure if you and I are using the same definition of the word map.
I'm not sure either. But, when I say map, maybe what I'm meaning is taking the risk reduction scores from the cross-functional factor and the RSE scores, and then mapping what applies to specific risk in other chapters. That's what I'm thinking. Is that what you mean by map?
We may have a total RSE for, and you mentioned emergency preparedness. We may say that has a certain value in totality. And then within each of the chapters that it has an influence on, we may reference that the value is somewhat, some part of that total value, but we really don't know what specific share. And I think you're asking us to identify the specific share. And there just may be some instances where that's not practical or may not be viable.
Okay, but if there are instances where it is clear for a certain thing, you would be open to doing that. Is that correct?
We will, again, we're early on in gathering of the data, and we will just see where things, how everything falls out. I mean, we're not opposed to it. I mean, I just can't commit to doing what you're asking us to do until we see how the data plays out.
I think that's fair. And I think that we should keep moving on. But I'd like to pose a question with respect to this and the wildfire mitigation plan. when you submit your wildfire mitigation plan, will these cross-functional factors be part of that and be considered within that, such that that being a subset and also being transferred to the ramp, will we then see some sort of quantification that then follows that? You know, these cross-functional factors like climate change, emergency preparedness, you know, those kind of factors do have a bearing on what you might want to propose in your wildfire mitigation plan. And how are you going to address that there, if at all? And that's just something that I'm curious about.
Yeah, Joe, I'll handle that one. Yeah, Ed, to keep that synchronicity between the two filings, we are definitely going to attempt to consider what you just said. Hopefully the timing works out, but that is definitely the intent, is to keep those two filings considering the same types of information when they're presented, so that you all don't have to like remember what you're looking at. If we're thought about this or that, we want them to look virtually the same.
And that'll provide us, the commission, and the Wildfire Safety Division, a good primer on how you're handling these cross-functional factors. And that might be the most illustrative way for us to come to grips with that at that time. That's just I'm thinking ahead.
All right, thank you.
Joe Mitchell, one quick question on, or statement on cross-functional factors. In the PG&E ramp, we made the suggestion that extreme wind be used as a cross-functional factor because it affects not only wildfire, but also infrastructure integrity. And it has impacts on both probability and outcomes. So just take that suggestion, and we'd suggest that gets incorporated as a cross-functional thing.
Thank you, Joe. And just for clarity, did PG&E have a climate change type of factor, and then you asked them to pull wind out of it?
There is a climate change factor, but wind is kind of orthogonal to climate change. There haven't been any real studies so far that have linked increased wind to climate change. In fact, they've sort of indicated the opposite. So,
okay. All right, appreciate the suggestion.
Welcome.
Thanks. I think it's Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. I think next. On the climate change discussion, the topic, it says climate change, adaptation, and natural forces. And that causes me concern because it seems to be viewing climate change as a natural phenomenon rather than a fossil fueled caused man-made phenomenon, or both. And I'm concerned that we're losing what was, I think, more appropriately done in the 2016 ramp, which is to look at the utilities' contributions to climate change. In other words, especially now, I mean, with the Aliso Canyon devastation, releasing however much methane into the atmosphere, unprecedented amounts. The utilities' contributions to climate change are only becoming more and more important, not less. So my concern is just in the name alone, I understand we'll get more information about this later, but in the name alone, I'm concerned that the utilities' contributions to climate change impacts and to worsening climate change impacts has been lost.
Definitely appreciate the input. I am not familiar enough with that particular factor to be able to really address to what extent are we focusing on climate change and also individually focusing on natural forces, or if there's some dotted line or solid line between the two. I am just unfamiliar enough. I am just unfamiliar, then I'm not able to opine on that, but I certainly, if others on the call from our team can, but then if not, we're certainly your comment is noted, and we'll be aware of that.
Thank you.
The other aspect of our ramp, our 2021 ramp, in addition to what's new, is we will be including, as has been mentioned multiple times so far, mostly during Mason's presentation, lessons learned and addressing feedback on our 2019 ramp. And if you could see my notes that I had as talking points, I'm going to say probably at least half of them, I put a check mark saying, oh, we've already discussed this as part of Mason's discussion. Discussed and came to an agreement is sometimes two different things. So again, this is feedback that we had recorded from our 2019. What we tried to do was look at, I think there were 3 or 4 different interveners that had provided feedback. We tried to pick 3 or 4 topics from each of them, so there was a fair representation, if you will, during today's presentation on concerns and feedback provided. It is in no particular order on these slides. Again, the first topic is modifications to MAVF, such as additional attributes, revised scales. As Mason has already mentioned, we have revisited the risk qualification framework, and as Mason has mentioned, we've added an attribute, trust and reputation, and then also a sub-attribute, the acres burned. And then also, as Mason had mentioned, we previously had a safety attribute, and now we've, if you will, expanded it to be health and safety. Also, as part of the revisit, adjustments were made to the weights to accommodate the additional attribute. Again, we took the 5% for the trust and reputation was taken from the financial, and again, there was a discussion on the previous slide as to some of our thoughts behind that. Another topic is excluding shareholder interest. This was also previously mentioned. Our scores do not include any shareholder interest, or paraphrased, our scores exclude shareholder interest. And so I think we've already mentioned that one. Accounting for secondary impacts. I think this is one that has not been previously discussed, and consistent with our approach last year, we will again be excluding, oh wait, hold on, wrong one. Sorry about that. Again, similar to what we did last year, we will be reviewing how each risk is impacted by secondary impacts. And then when the impact is material, we will then consider if or how to incorporate that impact. Additional tranches, we've already spoken about that one as well. We fully anticipate providing more tranches when appropriate, when and where appropriate. Changes to RSE, including when to perform and uses of range. We are planning to review all activities, and when we use the word activity, we are referring to controls or mitigations, to evaluate the usefulness of performing a RSE. And then with regards to use of ranges, we are continuing to evaluate the use of ranges to express uncertainty. Additional details on alternatives, including RSEs. We will meet the PUC's decision requirements to provide 2 alternatives for each risk identified, and we will also be calculating RSEs for those alternatives. Frequency and likelihood. I think we.
Excuse me. Can we ask about the previous slide before we move on?
Well, we were going to wait until we did both of them, but if you have a question now.
So for the changes to RSCs, I know you mentioned you're going to take a look at both controls and mitigations. Can you just explain what that means, that you're going to evaluate the usefulness of performing an RSC? Does that mean you are or are not going to assign RSCs to controls, or is it just based on whichever ones you feel like is quote unquote useful?
Well, Mason, you want to provide some additional detail on that?
Yeah. Hi, David. Like it says here, every single mitigation we're going to walk through and attempt to see what we can say about it. And if we think that communicating an RSE is actually counter to the actual facts, we might hold those back. There are examples that we do activities now. We will continue to seek funding for those activities that we've basically always done. And if we think, when we get to that point, if it gets to the point and we're looking at how do we evaluate the effectiveness of those mitigations, if it's just incredibly difficult to do that, or it's just complete guesswork, we're going to communicate that to you, or to the commission. We made an effort to see, but we just don't think we can provide an RSE that's meaningful. People tend to latch onto numbers. So if we say the number 7, people will think it means 7, when in actuality, the 7 could be the expected value of a range from 0 to 20. And we just want to be able to communicate that uncertainty around some of the mitigations. We don't know right now how many of those we think we'll have to perform that action on, but we are going to go through and meticulously evaluate how to do RSEs on everything. And if it's not the right thing to do, we think we reserve the right to not try to muddle the water by giving you a number that's meaningless. So that's how we're looking at it right now.
And Mason, it sounds that you're going to put significant effort into determining that. And of course, we would look to see that you provided the appropriate amount of substantiation or support for that determination, so that hopefully we, being reasonable, could come to the same conclusion based on the information that's provided in the RAMP filing.
That's exactly right, Ed. We don't intend on just saying nope and then move on. We intend to share our findings with the commission in the RAMP report to show how we got to where we got. And I will say, I think there are in some room, and you can see it here, to continue to evaluate the use of ranges. There is a lot of uncertainty in RSEs from their effectiveness and from the original risk scores. We're thinking about ways to communicate that to you. There's certainly going to be mitigations where we think we know the answer. We think if we do this, it's going to reduce the risk by 12%, for example. But other mitigations, it's a little less clear, and we want to be able to communicate with you like how certain we are. And we don't want you to get one number and say that's the number, because that's just not how a lot of this works. And we'll be very happy to communicate those findings and those whatever in the next.
Thank you for that. David, do you have any follow-up concerns or questions regarding that?
Yeah, just one quick point. I mean, we certainly understand that there are uncertainties, and but I think what we would disagree with is that you say that you're uncertain, or you think something is just guesswork, therefore you just omit it altogether. I think that's the part where we would disagree that that's an appropriate approach, and certainly it's also not compliant with the settlement of the decision. I think so. It requires that you provide the number, but you can certainly caveat it in terms of uncertainty, or if you want to use ranges, that's another approach. But I think it does need to be provided.
Well, I think you're making a valid point. We would think that a lack of information supporting the absence of an RSE or a significant qualification of what a RSE is for a particular mitigation or for one of the risks in the RAMP would be considered to be a deficiency and would need to be addressed through the RAMP or the GRC process to satisfy the settlement agreement and the concerns of interested parties and interveners. Thank you for your input. I think up next is Wendy has her hand raised.
Yes, just 1 minute. I need to turn off my timer. Just a second.
I guess the eggs have boiled.
No, it means the 7th period for my son. I wanted to follow up on the controls question. The Wildfire Safety Division is requiring RSCs for controls, I believe, or any kind of wildfire initiatives, whether they're called mitigations or whether they're called controls. So I want to ask, do you foresee that you'll at a minimum have RSCs, and even if there is some uncertainty and ranges for wildfire initiatives, mitigations, and controls?
Well, my answer to that would be we are going to do everything that we can to be compliant to the RAMP and the WMP requirements. And to the extent that we've talked with Ed, I think twice now, is we want to keep the WMP and the RAMP as consistent as possible. It's easier for everybody. So we want to follow those two, those are principles that we want to follow. And if it turns out that we present RSCs in a fashion that it's not exactly what everybody on the call is expecting, we'd be happy to make sure we address those concerns. We just know that numbers are very misleading sometimes when there's uncertainty around them, and we want to be able to address that. So I think we'll just take it under advisement and work with the commission to get the right answer for wildfire by the time the WMP is filed, and then for the rest of the RAMP by the time the RAMP is filed. So thank you for your feedback on those.
Great, thanks for that. I think we should move on.
Ed, I have one other question before you go on for the previous.
Can it wait till the end of the section so that we can let Joe finish this next slide and any others that follow, and then we'll have the mic open for questions at the end of the section so that we don't run over. We're pushing the time limits available for this already.
All right, on the second slide here for lessons learned, I think I already mentioned the likelihood and frequency issue. We've discussed that quite a bit today. There seems to be a disagreement. I'm not going to say little, just a straight up disagreement, possibly with regards to interpretation. Accounting for internal labor costs. I believe this is something new for this year. We will be estimates for internal labor costs will be included. There might have been some instances last year when they were not, but we will be including them this year. Discount costs. We will present the RAMP. We are anticipating presenting the RAMP in base year 2020 constant dollars. This approach is consistent with how dollars are presented in the GRC, and no additional discount is needed. I think, again, this was one of Tom's. This might be aligned with one of the questions Tom had. So again, I think we've already discussed it, and not sure if to the extent there's some additional questions when I finish. Creating standalone risks in RAMP for climate change, public safety, power shutoffs, and cyber attacks on the electric grid. And again, we've already discussed these to some extent. Climate change, we will be including it as a cross-functional factor. Treating PSPS, we are treating it as a sub-risk to the wildfire, not as a mitigation. And considering with regards to cyber attacks on the electric grid, we are considering tranching electric and gas cyber attacks to demonstrate how each will impact the risk event. And then the last one that we had identified for today is addressing overpressure events and utility contractor dig-ins. Overpressure events and utility contractor dig-ins are included within both the register, enterprise risk register, and the RAMP chapters. Within RAMP, the asset incident risk covering overpressure events, and equipment failure and incorrect operations are two possible drivers that would be capturing this. And with regards to dig-ins, the dig-in chapter covers both primary and secondary dig-ins, meaning if they are third party, if they are utility or contractor, they are all represented within the dig-in chapter. That does conclude that particular section. And so if there are some questions that folks have.
Yes, this is. Go back to the previous slide. And I apologize if you did. Sounds like you did discuss the tranches in detailed earlier this morning, but my question, can you explain a little, particularly for the wildfire risk, what you are expecting to do for tranches?
Yeah, I'll take that, Wendy.
Yeah, thank
Just a
you.
minute. This is Ed. Wendy, we're going to have a follow-up call specifically on tranches, and we're going to share more detail about that. So that might be a better forum for your more detailed granular questions on granularity. And I will loop you in to participate in that. So far, I've heard from Turn, they're going to do that. And as I mentioned earlier on in the workshop, if you are interested in following up on this, please send me an email. When I set up the WebEx, I will include you in that further exploration in tranches and granularity, so that we can move on in the interest of time.
Okay, I'm interested, so please take this comment as my note to you that I'm interested.
Hi, this is David again. I have one more question about, I think it's the next slide. I think you talked about this for accounting for internal labor costs. And I think you mentioned that you will be including those costs. Can you just explain what does the qualifier where applicable means? Like when would it not be applicable?
I cannot. I'm not sure if other folks are on the call can handle that. There may be, whether it be trying to distinguish between O&M and capital. Again, I'm just sort of going off the top of my head. I'm not quite, hopefully I'm not saying anything totally wrong. But if there's no one else on the call, we will definitely follow up on that one.
This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities, and I think I've made this point already, but just to be clear, the addressing the issue of cross-functional factor to address climate change adaptation, I'm assuming that the climate change issue is something that you're attempting to address from Protect Our Communities comments in the prior RAMP proceeding. And I just want to be clear that addressing climate change adaptation does not address the deficiencies that we identified. So we are talking about the public focused impacts of climate change caused by the utilities operations.
Okay, thank you.
I think I've made that point already. I just wanted to be clear.
Any other questions before we move on?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not sure if was someone else from SDG&E trying to answer my question earlier?
No, David, I think if other people were on the line that could answer it, they would have. And so I've noted it as a follow-up.
This is Chuck Feinstein. I have a question about the RSEs. Them discussion previously about ranges of RSEs, and I think that it's important to recognize that the RSE has been well defined in the settlement as the ratio of the present value of the expected risk reduction to the present value of the costs. I think what's going on is there's some confusion between the uncertainty in an outcome and the uncertainty in the expected value of that outcome. In this work and in these models, there is uncertainty in an outcome, but there is no uncertainty in expected value. That is a direct computation from the probability distributions that you have found. If that's the case, there is no uncertainty in the risk. If that's the case, there is no uncertainty in the risk-spend efficiency. If you would like to report other numbers other than RSE, that makes sense. But it does not make sense, in my opinion, to report a range for the RSE. That's simply inappropriate because there is no uncertainty in the expected value, and there is no uncertainty in the amount of money we're spending.
Dr. Feinstein, I think you pointed out the problem. The expected value that we are presenting in the RSE is the value that we would use, but expected values built upon large uncertainties are different than expected values built on more certainty. I know it's mathematically the same thing. You get the same answer, but the commission, I think, deserves to know when the expected values are, more centralized or more able to be computed. I know mathematically what you said is 100% correct, but we don't want to give the commission the impression that when we say 7, we mean that number is exactly 7. Sometimes that number is between 6.9 and 7.1. And other times that number is between 0 and 20. And I think there's a difference between those. And we would like the ability to communicate that to the commission. Now, whether we call it an RC, to your point, the RC has a definition. So it wouldn't technically be a range of RCs, but it would be a range of something that it's informative to the commission so they understand that the numbers presented have ranges of uncertainty. As presented right now, if we follow through with exactly the expected values, the commission would have no insight as to how uncertain the inputs into the decision making to choose those inputs were. And we would like the ability to communicate that. And I think the commission, once they understand what I'm talking about, would totally agree that it's appropriate to see when there is more uncertainty and when there's less uncertainty.
I understand what you're saying, but there is no uncertainty in the risk spend efficiency. There is uncertainty in an outcome. If you would like to create another index or something that describes what you think is important about the uncertainty in the outcome, I cannot stop you from doing that. I would only advise you that there is no theory of decision making that I'm familiar with that is based on anything that you're discussing. The theory of decision making that I'm familiar with uses the expected value of the utility of reducing the risk, which is exactly what we're measuring. So again, if you want to compute something else and report it, I can't stop you, but that's not what the settlement is about. The settlement is about computing risk spend efficiencies. And as you've admitted, there is no uncertainty in the risk spend efficiency. Therefore, there's no range for the risk spend efficiency.
This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities again. I agree with respect to the settlement and the RSCs. I also wanted to suggest, like, what the UNIPCC does is they say if there's something that there's a high level of confidence versus a low level of confidence, you could perhaps annotate that without taking away from what the settlement agreement requires.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I was talking too fast. I've never suggested once that we ventured from the settlement agreement to present RSEs. We would always give the expected value as the answer. When an RSE was provided, it would be exactly how the settlement is calling for it. We're talking about, in addition to giving that number, a range around that number that demonstrates the uncertainty around the inputs and the assumptions involved. That's all we're saying. So I hope that's clear.
Thanks for that, Mason. I don't disagree with that approach. I think it's important for the commission and other decision makers to understand that there is a potential for false precision when presented with a specific value, and that there are levels of confidence that might be important for decision makers to understand when evaluating the different mitigations and the proposals that are going to be presented through the RAMP and the GRC. But it's important to have a reference point, and I think the RSE provides that reference point upon which you're able to expound and provide more qualitative information that we can use. in this whole process. So I think we've noted the various points on this, and I know you're taking notes. And unless there's more discussion or clarification needed, I think now is a good time to move on.
So Ed, this is Eric Wojcik representing UCAN. You can hear me, I assume, right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to raise one question, and it comes in part from listening to the concerns, Melinda, that you've raised. And then Dr. Feinstein, what you just said was that basically the focus has been on risk, cost, and uncertainty, and that's the settlement sort of framework, or that within the settlement, that framework is directly applied. I'm thinking that one of the biggest risks actually is gas burn. It's a big risk. It's a big, huge risk, and it's not discussed that I can see directly, but that's risk sales uncertainty, I guess, or risk, because it's not per se cost to the utility directly in that they're compensated for it directly, but it's the risk of natural gas burn, carbon dioxide, and that is, we are talking about greenhouse gas impacts. We are talking about carbon issues. So where is this in the framework, or is it in the framework at all? Thank you for any answers.
I think you're talking about a societal impact from the consumption of natural gas. And that I don't think is contemplated here as a safety risk per se. And I think that that's a larger issue that the Commission is grappling with in their climate change initiatives and their review of the use of natural gas and potential electrification of consumers for heating, cooking, drying their clothes, all those things that we use natural gas for at a consumer level. There's also the discussion of using natural gas at electrical generation level. But I think these issues are beyond the scope of this particular RAMP proceeding. So I urge you to get involved in those other proceedings where your voice might provide some insights and elevate your concerns.
Well, thank you. Just one other point, if I can be very quick. We are talking about greenhouse greenhouse related risks and/or climate change, I should say, climate change related risks. And this is a very big climate change risk. So in some ways, I can't see how it shouldn't be considered as a safety issue. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but it's from a GRC perspective, the impacts on climate change are not contemplated at this level. And again, I would urge you to bring your concerns in the other proceedings that are more directly aligned with those concerns. We're looking at climate change in how it impacts the assets and operating circumstances under which safety becomes a more tangential physical concern, such as the destruction of power lines or wildfires or subsidence or something that has to do with the impact on the public, the employees, or individuals that might have a serious injury or fatality. But I appreciate what you're saying, but this isn't the forum for that.
I have to disagree wholeheartedly with this not being the forum for it. All of us as individuals, every company in the state should be, and most are, looking at their climate change contributions and looking at ways that their companies and each of us as individuals can reduce our climate change impacts. And so to say that climate change impacts caused by SoCalGas and SDG&E are not supposed to be considered in a risk proceeding it's not okay. We have to be discussing climate change in this proceeding. It does impact the GRC. We have to be assessing what the utilities are doing to contribute to climate change in order to be able to determine what the appropriate mitigation should be. Is it appropriate to continue to throw money at something that causes climate change and exacerbates climate change just so you can throw more money at them to help adapt climate change? I mean, we have got to be talking about the company's climate change impacts in this proceeding, in the GRC proceedings. It is a pervasive issue that cannot be siloed into a climate change proceeding. It must be addressed whenever it is relevant.
Wendy, did you want to say something? Your hand is up.
Oh, yeah, I think I was going to say something. I guess I just say that I think we should be open to addressing these issues. I do feel like, especially with all of the real impacts that we're facing now in the last few years with climate change, it's not something in the future, it's really more in the present. I just think personally, professionally, I think we should be open to including it in the RAMP and the GRC.
I'm not trying to diminish the severity of the concerns and the necessity for this being addressed. I just wanted to point out that the utilities are part of the cap and trade program. They pay for credits in order to generate electricity. I believe there's a agency in California that deals with that. The governor is dealing with it. The commission is dealing with it at higher levels and in a more specific way. The way that this proceeding has been designed, as I understand it, doesn't contemplate the societal impacts of electrical or gas operations and the greater impact on worldwide GHG levels and the necessity to consume natural gas to produce electricity. Those are decisions and activities that unfortunately take place, and a lot of people disagree with that, but I don't think that we can include a specific type of analysis of those impacts in a cogent way that we should then factor into this, other than through the proceedings that the commission has aligned with those concerns and those issues, because they're bigger than the RAMP at this point. You know, they should probably be dealt with and looped into the GRC, but that has rate implications that are beyond me. And and those subjects are above my pay grade. If I get word that this is something that we're supposed to include, that should probably be brought up in the SMAP. That should probably be brought up in a settlement agreement. That should probably be directed from the commission. As yet, those things haven't taken place. So we're constrained to use the RAMP in the way it's been designed in accordance with the objectives that we've been given. Having said that, I don't disagree that these are serious problems. But I think in the interest of time and the interest of this ramp, we need to move on.
If I could just make one follow-up question, a comment. This is Melinda Dickens from Protect Our Communities. Climate change was included as a chapter in the 2016 ramp. There have been only 2 ramps by SoCalGas and Sempra and SDG&E, and that was 2016, and the one that was cut short, 2019. One of them included climate change as a chapter, one of them did not. And it's not the case that there's been any direction saying you must exclude climate change from the risks that the companies are causing. It's a mistake it's a mistake to make that kind of a statement in this kind of a setting, because it's not true. We have to do it as a practical matter. We have to do it as to be in any way accurate in what we're doing, in what we're mitigating, in what risks we're assessing, and in what we're funding.
Excuse me, if this is Eric Wojcik again, just to quickly say that the proceeding, when it restarted, one of the questions was, what other matters need to be included? What other questions are not being addressed? And one of the clear statements I thought came from this, and is a direction now in this proceeding, is that climate change should be, the climate change proceeding even, should be potentially enjoined, and that climate change is a critical, one of the areas that needs to be explicitly included in this proceeding. So.
What other ways would our utilities have to affect climate change than simply say they're going to burn less gas? Supply less gas to the consumers that produce CO2 by burning it. I'm having trouble with seeing how this could practically work out.
And that's
Well,
the
energy
benefit of having
efficiency. Pardon me, this is Eric Wojcik, just real quick. The energy efficiency proceedings, the other proceedings are all saying, hey, in fact, SoCalGas and San Diego Gas and Electric are involved in both of those, to use less gas from electric generation by using much more energy efficiency and distributed energy resources, for example. And that's an explicit policy. It's explicit. And moreover, they are funding, SoCalGas is funding very large programs for energy efficiency and being very successful. So they're doing it themselves internally. That's a direct way to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases.
They are doing it through those programs, Eric and Melinda. And I think you've had a chance to raise your concerns. I'm sure they've been noted by Sempra. We've noted them. And I think belaboring this point is going to be counterproductive at this point.
Thank you. Thank
so
you.
I appreciate you raising it. And I think we need to move on to the next segment of the presentation.
Thank you, Ed. We're sort of wrapping up. The next section is fulfilling ramp requirements, and this is just an overview of what we have done to date, if you will, and we've gone over that as part of today's presentation. We've constructed the risk qualification framework, which in other terms is the MAVF, following the 6 principles of the SMAP settlement. We've used the enterprise risk register as the starting point for identifying the risks that will be included in RAMP. We've computed the safety risk score using only safety attributes for each risk in the enterprise risk register. We've computed a multi-attribute risk score for the top 40% of the enterprise register risks with a safety score greater than 0. And we've communicated the required information at least 14 days prior to today's workshop. We sent an email, I think we served something out on October 1st, FYIing a fair amount of the information in today's presentation, and then also informing of today's workshop. with regards to additional ramp requirements, when we finally submit our, I think there are going to be applications next year, we will have identified top risks, describe the mitigations currently in place. We will present a plan for improving the mitigations of each risk. We'll present each two alternatives for each two alternative mitigation plans for each risk. We'll provide risk reduction and risk spend efficiency calculations. We will identify lessons learned to apply in future rounds. We are moving towards probabilistic calculations, improve data collection, describe the company's safety culture, and responding to immediate crises outside of the RAMP and GRC process. And these, just FYI, I think these are 10 items that were in the one applicable decision regarding the SMAP. Down on the bottom is sort of also a little type of summary. We have the decision to our 2019 RAMP that gave certain orders with regards to what we should be including in our 2021 RAMP, feedback from the commission staff and interveners, lessons learned, and then also we are monitoring PG&E's 2020 RAMP to the extent it will be applicable. We feel it may be applicable for our RAMP. That is my presentation. To the extent we have questions on what I just overviewed, to the extent we have questions on anything else that where time is allowed, I have 151. So from a wrap-up standpoint, we were also wanted to just on a high level overview agenda topics. I'll put it out there real quick and just say.
I wanted to ask about these slides first before you go to the next section. You didn't give us a chance.
Go ahead.
Just a comment on the slide of requirements, and I remember you presented a similar slide in the last, for scale ramp. See, I just want to be clear. Somebody needs to. I want to be clear that this is Sempra's distillation of something from some decision somewhere or some group of decisions. I urge SPD not to view this as a checklist or something that as long as the Sempra utilities comply with this, they're good to go. I mean, it leaves out, for example, all of the many requirements of the SMAP settlement, and which are far more complex than what's presented here. So just please don't rely on this. This is one party's view of something, but not in any way, I hope, viewed as dispositive.
Thank you, Tom. Any other questions, comments on these particular slides?
Joe and Chuck and the rest of the Sempra team, I'd like to be able to extend the workshop beyond 2 p.m. To the extent possible. I'm not sure what WebEx is going to do when we hit the 2 o'clock time frame, but I want to make sure we've given everybody a chance to ask their questions on the slides and to discuss the workshop 2 agenda items.
Yeah, this is Chuck. It's fine. We'll, as many people from my team that can stay on, will do so. So that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
So I think to Ed's point, to the extent people there are any questions on anything that we've discussed today?
This is Wendy. Is it an appropriate time to ask Mason if he knows when he could get a slide or two to talk about to basically highlight the things he talked about with PSPS being planned to be a subset of the wildfire risk, and just kind of explain it more when he thinks he can get that to us?
Yeah, Wendy, I think some of the documents that we sent for that WINGS presentation might contain some of it. What we'll do is we'll go into that deck that we shared with you when we did the workshop, and we'll make sure we address any follow-up items that you've brought up today. And hopefully by the end of the month, we can get you something more clear about the direction we're planning on taking.
Okay, and that will also include the wildfire tranches question too that I was going to ask here, right? Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just as a general comment on the workshop, I just did also want to support that what POC and UCAN were trying to do. As Eric Wojcik pointed out, that's exactly the main purpose of this workshop, is for parties to raise concerns about whether what the utility is proposing to assess in terms of risks is the right scope or whether others should be added. So their comments were entirely on point and should be respected, I think. And furthermore, as to whether they're germane to the GRC is deciding what programs that the utility will implement for the upcoming for the GRC period, and impacts on climate change should be considered. There could be significant stranded asset issues if SoCalGas or SDG&E are building new pipelines or expanding pipeline capacity for gas that's not going to be used in the mid to long term. And so the GRC is the time to be thinking about that as well as the other proceedings. But just because they're being considered in other proceedings is not a reason to not consider them in the GRC. And to the extent that the risk analysis that we're working on in this ramp can help, that's a good thing. So.
Tom, I don't disagree. I don't think anybody was trying to diminish what their comments were. I was struggling to see how they might fit, but you bring up a very good point. If stranded assets are a risk, that's a risk to the company. They might also be a safety risk, where less maintenance is performed on assets that are deemed expendable or that will be stranded, and that might create a situation where there are greater safety concerns. But I'd like to be able to put things into context. So when things are raised, if we can put them into the context of how they would fit in with the ramp, would be additionally helpful.
This is Wendy. You know, I've been thinking about this issue, and Ed did raise the point about societal impacts kind of not, being difficult to address in the ramp. And I know, Tern, you've talked about this in other places, that you believe the RSE can include, societal impacts. Does Tern want to weigh in on that at all?
Well, we've addressed it in the context of PSPS with respect to PG&E. They had this notion of and I thought somewhat arbitrary distinction between primary impacts and secondary impacts. And they were saying, well, the impacts of the economic impacts of PSPS on lost wages, lost tax revenue, et cetera. That's something that they said was, that's secondary. So we're not going to consider that when we consider PSPS. And I'm not saying that's what Sempra's planning to do. It sounds like Mason's shaking his head. But that was sort of dismissed as a societal impact. And there's a risk that that's happening here when we talk about climate change. These things are just we don't have the data to be able to figure out the impacts of our operation of our gas facilities or gas-fired electric facilities on the public, on public health, on the like. And I would say that that's maybe not thinking hard enough about it. And I appreciate that. It sounds like the Sempra utilities are considering what one utility dismisses as secondary or overly broad societal impacts in the context of PSPS. I hope that Sempra might be willing to do that for some of the climate change issues that POC and UCAN have raised.
And I've been thinking about it more. I just wanted to weigh in. When you don't have data to SDG&E and maybe to Mason in particular, have you thought about using kind of machine learning, artificial intelligence modeling? You don't have data, to kind of use that to help you in your analysis, risk analysis?
Yeah, we use all sorts of techniques to kind of create proxies for what we think is the case. I don't want to conflate the environmental discussion with the lack of data. I don't think we've ever made that statement, so I don't want to confuse the two things. We certainly haven't said anything about we don't have enough data, that's why we're not doing environmental. That's nothing we've ever said.
Okay, so agenda topics for workshop number 2. What is the initial thoughts on that?
Pretty high level, to tell you the truth, Ed. And so again, to the extent we have a discussion, our initial thoughts were we did not want to really lock anything in. We weren't quite sure how this workshop was going to conclude, if we were going to be able to get everything in. Looks like we did, so that's good. But we're still working on preparing our ramp, and so we were thinking just to the extent we have updates, we would go over those updates, and to the extent there's applicable aspects from the risk-based decision-making framework, which I think some people are calling it the SMAP proceeding, we would also be going over those as well, again, to the extent they may be influencing or impacting our 2021 ramp. Did we lose Ed?
Oh.
Ed's got a yellow triangle where his face used to be.
Yeah, caution.
Okay, I guess
I got that early when I first dialed in, which meant nobody could hear me or see me.
Wendy, can you still hear us?
Yes. So I think he's coming back. I think he's coming back. Ed, are you able to hear us now? Oh, maybe not. Do you? Is this your last slide?
It is.
So are you expecting to ask people for input now if they have other
yes, if people have suggestions for the second workshop.
Okay,
Ed, did you hear what I said?
Yes, I heard you. I was having issues with my connection. I don't know if I was being bottlenecked at my Wi-Fi or if I was being timed out by WebEx. But I've heard you. I guess we should loop back and have a conversation about agenda topics. I haven't really broken it down in my mind what we need to cover in the next workshop, but I'll take that under advisement.
Ed, I was just mentioning, because you weren't here, that maybe others might have some thoughts too. I was trying to fill in for you.
Oh yeah, sure. If anybody has some thoughts on what we might cover, that would be appropriate to raise right now.
Oh, this is Tom from Turn. We've already flagged the tranche and granularity issue, and I know, Ed, you're pursuing a process for that may or may involve a workshop. So if it's something short of a workshop, that could be okay. If it's a workshop, that probably would be fine with us too. I think that might be better to hear about how Sempra is planning to address some of the unanswered questions from this workshop sooner rather than later. I know we were a little concerned about. I think Mason has been watching the confirmation hearings for Judge Barrett. Answers about whether what RSCs we're going to get. Are we going to get them for mitigations? Are we going to get them for what utilities like to call controls or not? And I think you took something out of the Barrett playbook there, Mason. It would be nice to get an answer to that. Are we going to get an analysis for everything, or are we just going to get it for things that you want to give them for?
Tom, can I chime in quick there?
Sure. Go ahead, Judge Barrett.
I may have not mentioned it, but I think I did. We haven't done the mitigation reviews in complete, so we don't have any idea at this point what the responses from the business units and the subject matter experts and the data says. I think we're sort of prejudging what those conclusions might be, and I don't want to put myself in a box. It's possible when we look at the 400 mitigations and then the tranches, which are actually on top of that, it's possible only 2 or 3 we might say don't deserve an RSE, and it's possible that maybe 20 do. We don't know yet, and I hope I made that clear, and I think that by the January workshop, we'll know more, and I'd be happy to share that with you as soon as I know it. I don't know it. I want to leave the door open that I don't want to make things worse by giving a number which is going to make it less of an issue than it was if we just said it's impossible to do. If it's determined, if the commission says no, give us whatever you got, no matter how made up it is, we'll do that too, to some extent. So we just don't know at this point. And as to your other comment, I haven't watched a single second of those things. I've determined that politics makes me angry, so I turn the stuff off. So
Yeah, join the crowd.
Yeah, Mason, are you able to answer the other question that Tom raised about RSEs for controls as well as mitigations?
yeah, sorry. My answer was to all activities, controls, mitigations, new, existing, proposed, whatever, all of them. We're going to look into what the data says and draw some conclusion and present that at the January workshop, and then await your feedback at that time to see how you like our response, and then hopefully we can pivot post feedback before May. That's still another 4 months to adjust. So I hope that answers the question.
And that raises a question, is a January workshop going to provide you enough time to pivot towards the final filing in May? Or should we have the workshop prior to January, given that December is usually a month which provides challenges for workshops due to the holidays?
I'm going to speak for my team, and they can feel free to tell me to be quiet. I'd prefer January because I think pivoting after we do the work is easier than trying to rush to do the work before the holidays to get that done, if that makes sense. If it comes down to, is at least on the RSC point, and I don't think there's actually that many unanswered questions. Hopefully, that's my perspective from this meeting. I don't think there's that many, and from the RSC point, we can pivot easily between January and even March. So I'm fine on that regard. Thank you.
Okay. When
This is Joe. I'm sorry, just real quick. When we internally had we had discussions internally back a while ago with when we thought a second workshop would work out best, and we thought January. And so again, we had a lot of input with regards to identifying January with regards to required amount of turnaround time and things like that, but we thought January would be good.
Okay, thanks for that. And it'll work for us. At some point, we should try to nail down a date so I can see how it fits with our calendar and SPD and RASA. Make sure we don't have any resource issues.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have a calendar yet for next year, so I guess I better get one.
I think to Mason's point about what's not been answered, another issue I raised was about the baseline, and so that's something we're very interested in. So an answer sooner than a January workshop would be helpful. But if it's an issue that's going to be one where Sempra and Turn don't see eye to eye, then we'd like to have an opportunity to talk about that at a workshop.
Maybe if we could identify those areas where there's some disagreement or potential disagreement, we can have a mini conversation or a mini workshop that's an hour or two to flesh out some sort of compromise or understanding about what's going to take place and hopefully satisfy everybody's concerns. do you want to take the time to flag your concerns, Tom, and maybe we can try to figure out some sort of venue or process for sorting those out?
Oh, I thought maybe I took too much time today flagging that concern.
I meant to me in writing in an email or something.
Well, haven't I done it? I mean,
well, it's in the recording. I've taken my notes, but I don't want to presume that my notes are as accurate as say, a summary that you would provide me. But I can go with that, and maybe I can create a meeting agenda when we talk about the tranches to talk further about, if there's any doubt about the RSEs or any doubt about the frequency or likelihood usage, we can revisit that at that time for a few minutes.
I'd be happy to. No, I have no problem with explaining the issue. I just took some pains today to make sure that Sempra understood. And that my comments were directed at Sempra. That they seem to understand quite well what I'm talking about. At least that's what they've said. So anyway, but I'm happy to summarize it in an email if that would be helpful.
No, that's fine. Okay, if you feel that you're confident that there's been a clear communication, I think then that won't be necessary.
But it's an old issue. It's like every ramp for every company it comes up, and so it's not new. And PG&E says they're going to do it. They're going to do it the way we were hoping. So
okay. Well, thanks for that. Anything else that we need to go over before we ring this off? Hearing none, I think the workshop has concluded. I will be in touch with folks about the tranche follow-up, and I look forward to your additional information with regards to the PSPS that you will send out. Having said that, thanks everybody. Thanks for everybody for participating. Thanks for all your views and input. And I will see how I can save this recording and put it somewhere or send it out somewhere for people to review if they want it. I don't know if it should be on a request basis or what our protocols are. I will find that out. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for their feedback. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.